59 years ago, a one-year-old girl vanished right in front of her house, disappearing without a trace, leaving her family in despair and a community gripped by unexplained fear. Authorities suspected a strange man who had been seen around the neighborhood might be involved, but with no body, no concrete evidence, and too few leads to pursue, the investigation quickly hit a dead end. Yet, through all those years, a desperate mother never gave up hope, clinging to the slim chance that her daughter might still be alive somewhere. Then one day, when old files long thought forgotten were reopened, investigators uncovered a crucial detail that everyone had overlooked, a detail powerful enough to upend the entire case and shock everyone involved in ways no one could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Colorado, 1966. The small towns scattered along the Rocky Mountains still maintained a slow, peaceful, and uneventful pace of life. In Fort Collins, every family knew each other. Kids played in front yards without worry. Doors were often left unlocked, and serious crime stories seemed to only come over the radio from distant states. In that setting, the Hughes family lived in a small white house on the edge of town. Daniel Hughes, a postal worker, a quiet but hard-working man. Mary Hughes, a young woman devoted to her family, and one-year-old Sophia, a little girl with gray-blue eyes and a calm demeanor, rarely crying, always clinging to her mother. On the morning of the incident, the sky was clear, the autumn air cool, and the leaves were gradually turning gold. Mary took Sophia out to the front yard and placed her on the grass mat near the steps, as she did every morning. Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor across the street, was watering her plants, while Daniel was in the backyard, fixing an old fence. It was a peaceful morning, repeating like countless days before it. No one imagined that in just a few minutes, the familiar world of the Hughes family would be torn apart forever. The unusual signs appeared very subtly, almost not enough to alarm a family living in this safe town. A light-colored small truck that Mary felt she had seen parked on the street a few times that week, and a strange man in a green baseball cap standing farther away, glancing briefly toward the yard before walking off. No one did anything suspicious. There was no specific behavior to indicate danger, just small things that Mary hesitantly noted in her mind, then reassured herself that the person might just be looking for an address or passing through. When Mary picked Sophia up and went inside for a few minutes to get a bottle and a light jacket, she didn't think that short time would be long enough to change their entire lives. When she stepped back out to the doorstep, the grass mat in the front yard no longer had Sophia on it. There was no crying, no loud noise, just a sudden absence that took Mary's breath away. She rushed down to the yard, checking around the bushes, the fence corners, the places the child might have crawled to. Daniel heard his wife calling and ran from the backyard to join the search. Neighbors heard the panicked shouts and came over, initially believing the baby had just hidden somewhere around the house, something common with young children. But after a few minutes of searching, no one found any trace. Mrs. Peterson said she heard a car door slam shut hard, but wasn't sure exactly when. The neighbor boy thought he saw someone carrying a child, but couldn't see the face clearly. A gardener at the end of the street said he saw the light-colored truck leaving the neighborhood faster than usual. None of the information was clear enough to confirm anything, but all pointed toward the possibility that Sophia hadn't left the yard on her own. Mary gradually fell into panic, calling her daughter's name repeatedly. Daniel ran along the street, hoping to spot something, but in vain. The spontaneous search became chaotic, with people running through yards, bushes, and side areas, but there was no object or sign indicating Sophia might still be in the area. After all the nearest search directions proved fruitless, Daniel went back inside, breathing heavily, hands shaking as he picked up the phone and reported to the police that their daughter had disappeared, and none of the neighbors had found the baby in any surrounding areas. That call was immediately transferred to the Larimer County 911 dispatch under emergency classification, where the operator logged the report as a young child missing from front yard, likely unable to move on her own. The dispatcher asked the required questions to determine the urgency: the child's age, circumstances of disappearance, any signs of injury or leaving voluntarily, then immediately forwarded the information to the nearest patrol unit. 2 patrol officers in the area, accustomed to minor incidents like neighbor disputes or false alarms, received orders to proceed to the scene immediately. When they arrived, the patrol car stopped in front of the Hughes house, and the initial chaotic scene showed the situation was more serious than the preliminary report suggested. Neighbors gathered in the front yard, Mary sobbing uncontrollably, Daniel still running around checking places no baby girl could possibly fit into. The officers asked everyone to stop moving to avoid contaminating the scene, while separating Mary and Daniel to collect initial statements per procedure: the last time Sophia was seen, who was in the house, activities before the disappearance, any unusual sounds or sights. They took an accurate description of the child: age 1, light blonde hair, wearing a thin sweater and overalls. One officer walked around the front yard, side of the house, and access road to the neighborhood to assess the terrain, while the other checked the possibility that Sophia had crawled or walked away on her own. However, there were no signs she had left her initial position. During information gathering, witnesses were asked to describe exactly what they saw or heard, but since events unfolded so quickly, statements were fragmented and lacked common points. These details were noted by police, but not yet classified as significant leads. As in the 1960s procedure, officers typically prioritized ruling out child wandered around the house before considering stranger abduction. In the initial report, police noted that the surrounding area had many bushes, dark corners, and spots a child could crawl into. This assessment leaned toward Sophia possibly wandering into a hidden spot rather than being taken. This directly affected the speed of deploying forces, as with the lost child hypothesis. Police did not immediately set up roadblocks or track suspicious vehicles. Throughout this time, Mary repeatedly described the uneasy feeling from the strange truck appearing days earlier and seeing the man in the green cap looking toward the yard. However, due to lack of specific details and no large-scale missing child alert system, this was noted only as information to follow up, not treated as evidence of a targeted abduction. The initial assessment not linking Sophia's disappearance to criminal activity meant the critical first minutes were spent checking the local area rather than pursuing suspicious vehicles. Officers continued reviewing witness statements and re-examining the scene to determine priority search directions, but no decisions went beyond the assumption the child left the yard on her own. Meanwhile, Mary and Daniel had to stop searching to provide more precise information on timing, location, and any changes in family routine to support a more detailed report. These initial collection steps followed standard procedure of the era, but the delay in recognizing the case's nature created a significant gap, with major consequences for the entire subsequent investigation. When the officers completed preliminary information gathering from the family and witnesses, they moved to the first scene sweep per investigative procedure of the time. The primary goal in this phase was to determine the range a 1-year-old Sophia could naturally move, while delineating spaces where traces might remain intact before further disturbance. To do this, police asked everyone present in the yard to step back toward the front of the house and maintain distance to avoid altering the ground surface or accidentally covering child movement signs. The cordoned area started from the steps where Mary placed Sophia before going inside, extending to the entire front lawn, land along the left fence, small plot near the side alley leading to the main street, and a gravel path segment from the yard to the road. Officers used measuring tape to calculate the maximum radius a 1-year-old could crawl or toddle in a few minutes. Behavioral data on young children used by police at this stage indicated that kids Sophia's age typically couldn't go beyond a few meters from the starting point without notable obstacles or deep steps causing them to stop. However, when sweeping the lawn surface, police found no drag marks or depressions indicating Sophia had crawled or sat down. Any indentations on the grass, if present, belonged to adult footprints from the earlier spontaneous search. This made determining movement direction more difficult. They continued surveying the area near the fence, where there were low bushes. One officer lightly probed the foliage with a stick to detect if anything small was caught, but found nothing. Spots like under the steps, door edges, and gaps under the railing were thoroughly checked to rule out the baby being stuck. All yielded no sign Sophia had been there after Mary left the yard. When expanding to the land along the side alley, where the soil was softer than the lawn, police hoped to find small depressions, possibly from a child. However, the ground only showed adult shoe prints from those who had run around searching before police arrived. There were no secondary low-level signs or short distance marks indicating Sophia left the initial spot on her own. From the lack of slide, roll, or clothing friction marks on the dirt, officers tentatively concluded the likelihood of Sophia leaving the area voluntarily was very low. This conclusion began conflicting with the initial assumption she might have wandered around the yard, but with no other leads, police noted it as insufficient to shift investigative direction. While one group of officers continued checking the lawn and fence, another closely observed the road edge where the small street in front of the Hughes house met the yard. Though most surfaces were blurred by vehicle and foot traffic, a section of dirt at the grass edge revealed a slightly depressed semicircular groove, short in length, not matching common car tire patterns in the neighborhood. After shining a light and noting the shape, the officer marked it as possibly from a truck tire or larger vehicle tire. The groove position indicated the vehicle stopped closer to the grass edge than normal. Though the tire mark wasn't sharp enough to determine subsequent direction, its appearance at the closest point to Sophia's disappearance led police to log it as important scene evidence. They measured groove, width, depth, and distance between symmetric grooves for comparison with common tire types in the state. The tire mark appeared fairly isolated, not in a continuous chain, possibly because the vehicle stopped very briefly before leaving. The lack of extending marks onto the street showed the road surface had been erased by later traffic. Besides the tire mark, there were no child footprints or small items around the area. The failure to find any signs of Sophia within a reasonable child-accessible range further reinforced that she did not leave the yard on her own. Upon completing the first scene sweep, police compiled the data: no signs of Sophia moving, no physical evidence belonging to her, no signs of injury or fall, and the presence of a tire mark not matching family or nearby neighbor vehicles. This information was fully documented in the scene report and became the basis for evaluating the situation in the next investigative step. After completing the first scene sweep, police shifted to collecting witness statements to identify data that could connect to the newly discovered tire mark. Gathering statements had to be done quickly before witnesses' memories were contaminated by neighbor discussions or spreading community stress. Police separately interviewed each witness away from the crowd for independent recording, starting with those closest to the scene. Mrs. Peterson, watering plants across from the Hughes house that morning, provided a consistent statement. She confirmed hearing a loud car door slam around the time. Mary said she went inside for the bottle, but didn't see the vehicle because her own car blocked the view. She wasn't sure which vehicle, but described the sound as from a truck or old pickup, not the light sound of a newer sedan. This was the first statement linking a sound to the possible disappearance time frame. The second witness was the boy living next door, who had been playing outside that morning. He said he saw a man in a green cap walking along the curb, but couldn't remember the face, height, or other clothing clearly. He couldn't confirm if the person was carrying anything, only recalling that he didn't seem like someone from the neighborhood. This statement directly related to a stranger's presence, but lacked details, requiring cross-referencing. The third witness was the gardener trimming grass at the street's end. He reported seeing a small light-colored truck, possibly gray, white, or beige, leaving the neighborhood faster than normal. He didn't see the driver or remember the license plate, but described the vehicle size matching the tire mark police found at the grass edge. This was the only statement aligning with physical evidence at the scene, increasing the likelihood the truck was involved in Sophia's disappearance. When compiling the three independent statements, police noted intersections. The stranger's appearance timing roughly matched. When Mary went inside, the door slam sound occurred during Sophia's disappearance window, and the light-colored truck left the area abnormally. These points weren't enough for conclusions, but formed a temporary related data chain. Police further cross-checked the boy's stranger description with Mary's earlier account of seeing a man in a green baseball cap looking toward the yard. Both independent descriptions mentioned the green cap, suggesting the same person appeared in the area that morning and prior days. Though lacking facial or build specifics, the matching identifying accessory led police to weigh it highly. Regarding the vehicle, the gardener's statement and seen tire mark both pointed to a small to medium truck, not a family sedan. This helped rule out most vehicles parked on the street that morning, reinforcing the hypothesis that the related vehicle didn't belong to local residents. In cross-referencing data, police categorized information into high reliability, supporting, and insufficient value groups. From this structure, they set a temporary investigative direction, focus on the truck present around Sophia's disappearance time, while tracking the man in the green cap who walked the street. They noted the stranger and vehicle might be connected, or merely coincidental appearances near the incident time. However, without surveillance cameras or automated identification methods, the entire process relied on statement accuracy. Police compiled a list of truck types matching descriptions, marked the last sighting location, and prepared to gather more statements from nearby homes for additional witnesses to the truck or strange man. By the end of the first cross-referencing round, investigators had sketched a temporary information structure. Sophia couldn't have left the area alone. A strange vehicle appeared near the scene, and an unfamiliar man was present in the relevant time frame. These details weren't enough to identify a perpetrator or accurately reconstruct events, but strong enough for police to shift focus from the lost child hypothesis to the possibility Sophia was removed from the area by a motor vehicle. With this new direction, the police immediately shifted to the first expanded search phase, broadening the sweep to the entire residential area surrounding the Hughes home to determine the suspect's initial direction of movement. The patrol team divided the area into small search grids based on street maps, starting from the roads directly connected to the house and expanding outward to a radius of several hundred meters. They went door to door asking if anyone had seen a little girl wandering or heard crying that morning, but most residents reported nothing unusual beyond the commotion after the Hughes family discovered Sophia was missing. During the sweep, the search teams checked vacant lots, rarely used backyards, and areas where a child might crawl into, such as under vehicles, deep porches, or hidden corners behind sheds. All potential spots where the child might have accidentally gotten into were illuminated and examined. But no signs of clothing, belongings, or footprints belonging to a child were found. After covering the entire nearest residential area without results, the police expanded the scope to include a small park, a few blocks from the Hughes home. The park area had a playground, dirt paths, and several large bushes. The search team advanced in a line formation to avoid missing anything, using sticks to probe each bush cluster and listening for any faint sounds that might come from a child. However, there were no indications that Sophia had ever been in this area. Her age also made it nearly impossible for her to travel that far in such a short time, unless someone had carried her. Since the possibility of the child falling into a pit or near a water ditch still needed to be ruled out, the search team continued expanding toward the drainage ditches running from the residential area to the main road. These ditches had slow-flowing water, with many sections covered by tall grass, so the police conducted a continuous sweep along the banks. They checked each soft soil section for indentations or slide marks, but the ground showed no signs corresponding to a small child's movement. In deeper water sections, rescue personnel used long hooks to ensure nothing was caught on the bottom, and all results were negative. After completing all areas that could reasonably be accessed within the time frame from Sophia's disappearance to the police report, the search teams regrouped near the Hughes home to compile data. The overall results showed no evidence supporting the hypothesis that the child had wandered off the yard on her own. No footprints, no scuff marks on the ground, no dropped belongings, no sounds or sightings recorded in public areas. This reinforced two possibilities. Either Sophia had been placed in a vehicle and removed from the area in a very short time window, or there was some factor outside direct observation that the police had not yet identified. However, since the gardener's account of a truck leaving quickly matched the timing of the disappearance, the search command was forced to reassess the case's level of danger. In the updated report sent to the Coordination Center, the field commander noted clearly that the absence of traces throughout the entire residential area and surrounding park significantly reduced the likelihood of the child's safety if she was still nearby. This markedly increased the risk of her having been taken out of the area by vehicle, meaning the situation might have escalated beyond a standard search scope. At the same time, the police updated the search map, marking checked areas to avoid duplication, preparing for the next steps if the case was reclassified as more serious. Upon concluding the first expanded search operation, authorities determined that all areas Sophia could have reached on her own had been thoroughly searched without yielding any traces related to the victim. This result reinforced the assessment that the child was no longer within the residential area. Therefore, the police were forced to shift the investigation's focus to the most significant remaining piece of evidence at the scene: the tire tracks imprinted on the grass edge, right next to where the child disappeared. This was the only physical clue with potential direct relation to movement out of the area, as other signs were vague or reliant on witness statements. To analyze the tire tracks, the police used a standard tread gauge kit, recording the width, depth, and spacing between the symmetrical tracks on the ground. The tread pattern obtained differed from typical passenger car tires in the residential area at that time, which had narrow, shallow grooves with few lugs. The scene tracks indicated larger tires, most likely from older light trucks or pickups. When cross-referencing with tire models circulating in Colorado during the 1960s, the police eliminated most common civilian vehicles like sedans or station wagons. Instead, the tread characteristics better matched tire models for small trucks produced by manufacturers like Ford, Chevrolet, and Dodge in the early 1960s. Specifically, the deep tread and width closely resembled certain Goodyear and Firestone models designed for light-duty trucks, especially those that had been used for years and showed uneven wear. The police added a note that the slightly offset tread suggested the vehicle might have carried uneven loads or worn due to prolonged use. This detail helped narrow comparisons since not all trucks in the area would have similar wear patterns. After analyzing the pattern, the investigation team moved to identifying vehicle types. They compiled a list of matching truck models, including three main groups: compact trucks produced from 1958, 1964, mid-size pickups common in manual labor, and light commercial vehicles used by businesses or individuals for tool transport. This narrowing allowed reducing the number of vehicles to check within an expanded radius, as the town of Fort Collins and surrounding areas did not have a high density of trucks among residents. The next step was compiling a list of matching vehicles within a few miles. The police used Larimer County vehicle registration records. Cross-referencing type, production year, and paint color were recorded. Although 1966 records were not as complete as modern systems, the police still identified several owners with trucks fitting the general description. Among these, two types drew attention: light-colored pickups or small trucks with faded paint over time. Since the witness only described a light-colored vehicle without specific shade, the police expanded the list to include white, beige, light gray, or silvered from age vehicles. The initial list included over 10 vehicles registered in the county and some from nearby residents who frequently passed through town. However, not all matched the scene tread, as tire sizes and lug patterns varied across models. Therefore, the investigation team conducted deeper classification, eliminating tires that were too large or too small, or vehicles whose tires did not match the tread pattern. Narrowing the vehicle list was relatively feasible due to the distinct differences of the scene tread from common tires. After completing this narrowing, the police began checking each owner. they directly contacted those with registered matching vehicles to verify the vehicle's location on the morning Sophia disappeared. Some owners were quickly eliminated after providing clear alibis. The vehicle was in a shop for repairs, used dozens of miles away, or confirmed by the owner as not leaving the property all day. However, some owners were not home or could not precisely confirm the vehicle's use that morning. For these cases, the police had to place them in a needs further checking group due to incomplete information. Additionally, while checking bordering areas, the investigation noted the existence of some vehicles not in county registration, those belonging to out-of-towners, transient workers, or no longer validly registered. These types were harder to trace and became a high-risk group since owners could not be quickly verified. To broaden the inquiry, the police compiled a list of unfamiliar trucks seen in the neighborhood in recent weeks, based on resident accounts. Many recalled a light-colored truck appearing irregularly, parking in different spots around the residential area, but no one knew the owner or purpose. These details were added to the comparison list, though not yet confirmed as fully matching the seen vehicle. By the end of the checking process, the police had formed a structured list of suspect vehicles consisting of local verifiable vehicles, local non-verifiable vehicles, and unfamiliar vehicles seen multiple times in the area. This list became the foundation for expanding the driver inquiry and cross-referencing with provided witness data, while reinforcing the hypothesis that the vehicle played a key role in Sophia's disappearance. Once the suspect vehicle list was formed with three main groups, the police began the suspect screening phase based on data related to the vehicles and the timing of Sophia's disappearance. The first group approached was local owners with valid registrations and vehicles matching the tire description. The police interviewed each owner, requiring them to describe the vehicle's condition, travel schedule on the morning of the incident, and provide any witnesses who could confirm their location. The first owner was a plumber living a few streets away. His truck was an older model, light-colored, and could fit the general description. However, when working with police, he provided a clear alibi at the time of the incident. He was working at a site in the south part of town, with multiple witnesses confirming his presence. Additionally, a quick physical check showed his tires had a significantly different lug pattern from the scene tracks. This eliminated him from the suspect list. The police continued to other owners in the verifiable local vehicle group. Some owners stated they did not use the vehicle that day or were out of town, and most had confirmations. In these cases, the police cross-checked statements with witness timelines and locations to verify the accounts. As a result, many citizens with matching vehicles were quickly eliminated, significantly narrowing the list. As the group of owners with clear alibis dwindled, the police shifted to owners unable to verify their location that morning. Some owners did not recall exactly when they left home, where they went, or had no confirming witnesses. This required deeper evaluation based on behavior, habits, occupation, and reasonable reasons for travel at that time. However, most of these individuals still had plausible explanations, such as shopping, going to work, or visiting relatives, so while not fully eliminated, they did not become primary suspects. The final owner group, unfamiliar vehicles reported seen around the neighborhood in the prior week, was prioritized. This was the highest risk group due to lack of registration records, no ties to local residents, and no county data confirmation. The police canvassed door to door to see who else had seen this vehicle, aiming to determine travel direction, parking times, and any notable driver interaction. Some residents recalled the light-colored truck sometimes parking briefly, then leaving without anyone recognizing the driver. This matched the behavior pattern police believed could relate to pre-incident family surveillance. However, the lack of specific vehicle shape or license plate descriptions made tracing difficult. To clarify, the police cross-referenced back to statements about the man in the green hat. They searched the owner list for individuals matching the description or previously noted in the area. Though no local owners matched this man, additional witness data helped connect the possibility that the unfamiliar vehicle belonged to someone living outside the area. By the end of the screening round, the suspect list was narrowed to a small group of owners unverifiable during the critical time, and unfamiliar unregistered vehicles. Though not yet enough data to conclude, the police recognized the unfamiliar vehicle group as the next search focus, since it better fit the suspect vehicle profile than local ones. Through this screening process, the investigation team reduced the scope from dozens of owners to just a few cases needing monitoring, creating a foundation for the next step in identifying the vehicle owner potentially linked to Sophia's disappearance. After the potential suspect list was narrowed, but no individual yet had sufficient basis for deep follow-up, the police returned to the standard procedure of that era, investigating the family internally and those living near the scene, to rule out the disappearance originating from conflict or behavior within the family scope. Though no clear signs indicated parental involvement, checking them remained mandatory before officially shifting the investigation to stranger direction. This reflected the view of many law enforcement agencies in the 1960s, which held that most incidents involving young children stemmed from relatives or caregivers. The police interviewed Mary and Daniel separately, requiring them to recount the entire morning's events, from waking up, daily routines, family interactions, and any recent conflicts or tensions possibly related to the case. Mary was asked about her daily schedule with Sophia, the time she took her eyes off the child, and why she felt uneasy about the stranger's presence. Daniel was required to describe his fence repair work, exact position when hearing Mary call, and response time. Both faced questions to check consistency, including why they did not monitor the surrounding area more closely and whether anyone else knew about the routine of letting Sophia play in the yard. Though their statements were consistent and matched police observations, answering numerous oversight questions diverted investigation team time from the vehicle trace direction. Concurrently, the police investigated neighbors to rule out anyone in the area directly involved in Sophia's disappearance. Those living near the Hughes family were asked about relationship history, any past conflicts or unusual behavior among residents. They also checked if any household had unusually frequent recent contact with Sophia or shown suspicious behavior. However, the neighborhood where the Hughes lived was a small residential community where most residents had known each other for years, with no reports of major conflicts or criminal histories. The police reviewed each household's records to see if anyone owned a matching vehicle or had unusual travel reasons that morning. But results further confirmed no one owned a described truck or was on the suspect route at the critical time. The internal family and neighbor investigation, though procedurally necessary, yielded no new data and produced no weighted suspects. Time spent gathering, verifying, and documenting statements prevented full focus on the unfamiliar vehicle group or unverifiable owners. As a result, the precious time immediately after the incident, the critical period for tracing the departing vehicle, was fragmented by the misdirected investigation path. While police focused on eliminating relatives and neighbors, the opportunity to trace the vehicle, the only direction then showing potential to lead to Sophia, was delayed. This delay not only reduced access to fresh information, but also risked physical traces outside the residential area being erased by normal traffic, making following the escape route more difficult. At the conclusion of the internal investigation phase, the police affirmed no evidence pointed to parental or neighborhood resident roles in Sophia's disappearance. However, enough time had passed that initial clues related to the vehicle or stranger lost urgency, and returning to this investigation direction became more complex than immediately after the incident. When the internal investigation direction was closed without detecting any suspicious signs, the police returned to comprehensively reviewing the crime scene records and data collected in the initial days, but there was no significant progress. The tire tracks, the only physical clue, could not be matched to any specific vehicle in the area, and the strange vehicles that had appeared around the neighborhood were not clearly identified, making tracing nearly deadlocked. Witness statements, although matching in a few points, still lacked certainty. No one clearly saw the license plate, no one identified the man wearing the green hat, and no one could accurately confirm the time the vehicle left the residential area to directly link it to the moment Sophia disappeared. These factors caused all the collected information to fall into a state where it could not be developed further. The crime scene at this point also no longer provided additional data. The initial traces had been erased by time, weather, and resident activities in the subsequent hours and days. The area around the Hughes home did not have terrain features capable of retaining marks for long, making additional review efforts yield no results. Potential locations that could conceal signs of the child's movement, such as bushes, soft ground, or narrow paths, had all been checked multiple times with no new discoveries. The ditches, parks, and public areas had been thoroughly searched during the expanded search phase, and repeating these steps also did not help add any valuable data. On the witness front, the police attempted to recontact some individuals who had provided initial information to verify new details or clarify uncertain points. However, their memories had begun to change over time. Some said they could not remember the exact time or vehicle characteristics accurately, while others stated they were no longer sure about what they had seen. This caused the early statements to be considered insufficiently reliable to advance the process. The movement map of the suspect vehicle also became useless, as no one could remember the direction the vehicle took after leaving the neighborhood. In the context of no new information, the police began re-evaluating the possibility that the victim was still in the area, but the realistic conclusion was that continuing repetitive searches would only consume resources without increasing the chances of discovery. The search teams were withdrawn, leaving only basic patrols by local police. In terms of the investigation file, the summary report after 2 months showed that all directions were blocked. No physical evidence, no vehicle data, no weighted suspects, and no signs of ransom demands or anonymous letters to determine the purpose of the incident. With a long period without any new clues, the investigating agency was forced to transfer the case to suspended status. In internal documents, Sophia Hughes's case was classified according to 1960s criteria as missing with undetermined cause, high likelihood, no longer in the initial area. Although the Hughes family continued to provide information whenever they remembered additional details, these notes did not change the police conclusion, as they did not open any new investigative directions. Transferring the file to suspended status did not mean the case was completely closed. Instead, it was stored in the list for review when resources or new data became available. However, in the limited investigative context of the 1960s, child missing cases without clear evidence were often very difficult to reprioritize without additional external information. From this point, the case officially entered a deadlock state: no progress from the scene, no witness information, no identified vehicle, and the police had no further investigative actions that could yield practical results. Sophia Hughes's file was placed into the cold case category for the first time, marking the phase where the investigation could no longer advance, while the family had to continue living with the absence of data and increasingly faint hope that little Sophia could be found. In 1970, 4 years after Sophia Hughes's missing person file was placed on suspended status, the Larimer County Sheriff's Office implemented a program to review backlog cases to identify those that could be reinvestigated with new personnel or improved crime scene analysis techniques. Investigator Harold Monroe, a young investigator who had just transferred from Denver, was assigned to approach the Sophia case as part of his task to reevaluate unresolved child missing cases. Monroe began by studying all the archived documents, crime scene reports, witness statements, lists of suspect vehicles, and area maps used in 1966. What first caught his attention was the fragmented nature of information recording from that era. The tire tracks were not fully measured, the direction the vehicle left the scene was not clearly confirmed, and the timing of some statements was not accurately recorded. Noting these irregularities, Monroe decided to reconstruct the crime scene based on original data, the actual terrain of Fort Collins, and the roadways existing in the 1960s. He started by returning to the Hughes family home, resurveying the front yard area, the curb, the side alley direction, and escape routes from the residential area. Although the area had changed somewhat over time, the street structure and alleys remained the same, allowing Monroe to redetermine the mobility possibilities for a vehicle intending to leave the area quickly. From the starting point at the curb where the tire tracks were recorded, he examined all possible directions that would allow a truck to leave the neighborhood without drawing much attention. By combining witness statements about the time they saw the vehicle leave, Monroe realized that in reality, the suspect vehicle could have chosen one of two main routes: northeast into the town center or northwest out of the residential area and toward the major road connecting to neighboring states. When cross-referencing with the characteristics of the strange vehicle's driver, Monroe concluded that choosing the direction out of town was more logically probable than proceeding deeper into the crowded residential area. This led him to question the 1966 investigation direction, which focused on the hypothesis that the suspect might still be in the area. To strengthen his analysis, Monroe used 1966 road maps provided by the Colorado Department of Transportation, identifying routes that were low traffic but convenient for quickly leaving Fort Collins. He paid special attention to the northern route, connecting to Wyoming, a route that was minimally controlled at the time, with remote sections suitable for an abductor needing to leave the area quickly without drawing attention. When comparing this to the fact that no one in the neighborhood identified the man in the green hat, Monroe considered it highly likely that this person came from outside the town. This increased the weight of the hypothesis that the vehicle did not originate from Fort Collins, but was just passing through or stopped temporarily to commit the act. From there, he reconstructed the most feasible route. The truck believed to be parked near the Hughes home could leave the small street, cross two intersections, then merge into a secondary road leading to the highway, and then turn north to head straight to the Wyoming state border. The distance from the Hughes home to the state line at that time would take just over an hour if driving continuously, and since there was no alert system or checkpoints, the vehicle could easily leave Colorado before police expanded the search radius. Monroe continued cross-referencing this movement direction with information from 1966. Reports showed that police at the time mainly focused on the residential area and the northeast direction into the inner city because they assumed the abductor might try to hide within close range of the victim's home. This analysis, according to Monroe, was unrealistic, as there were no signs that the perpetrator was familiar with the area or had reason to stay near the scene. Moreover, the tire tracks appearing close to the grass edge suggested a quick stop, consistent with approaching the target and leaving immediately after achieving the goal. When evaluating all the data, Monroe clearly determined that the initial investigation direction had overlooked an important possibility. The perpetrator could be from another state, using a truck to enter the town, abduct Sophia in a very short time, then leave Colorado, making searches within a small radius completely fruitless. This discovery led him to propose expanding the search scope northward, along the route leading to Wyoming, where individuals using similar vehicles might have resided or operated during that period. Monroe suggested including the Wyoming route in the list of areas to verify, including reviewing old truck owners registered in small towns near the border and checking records of people who entered or left Colorado via this route at the exact time of the incident. Although this proposal did not come with evidence identifying the perpetrator, it provided a completely new investigative direction, opposing the initial assumption that the abductor was local. With logical route analysis, feasibility assessment, and pointing out errors when the initial law enforcement agency did not consider interstate movement, Monroe officially recommended that the Wyoming direction be considered the primary possibility in tracing the vehicle and owner related to Sophia Hughes's disappearance. When the proposal to expand the investigation toward Wyoming was approved at the administrative review level, Monroe began collecting data from counties bordering northern Colorado, focusing on lists of owners of older light trucks registered during the 1965-1967 period. Records from that era were incomplete, but sufficient for him to identify some owners whose vehicles matched the description of the light-colored truck and tire patterns, potentially matching the tracks collected at the 1966 scene. When cross-referencing the Wyoming owner list with parameters Monroe reconstructed from the tire tracks including tire size, likely vehicle models, uneven wear levels. He narrowed the initial list of dozens of owners down to just a few, with vehicles matching both technical characteristics and wear patterns. One of them was a man named Thomas Avery, residing in a small town not far from the Wyoming border, who owned a 1961 light gray truck that had been repaired multiple times. This truck, according to records, had its front tires replaced in 1965 with a limited production model that Monroe assessed as having the highest likelihood of matching the track grooves still documented in the 1966 scene photos. This was the first time since Monroe reopened the file that a name appeared with a high degree of match between the vehicle, residence location, and movement direction toward Wyoming. Recognizing Avery's potential as a key suspect, Monroe began analyzing the man's background. Avery was born in 1935, had worked in local transportation, frequently traveling between small towns in Wyoming and the Colorado border. Employment records showed he abruptly quit at the end of 1966 for unknown reasons and had a period of over a year without appearing in any official employment records, which was unusual for someone in continuous transportation work. This coincided with the time after Sophia's disappearance, making Monroe take special note. When examining personal life, Monroe discovered an important fact. Avery had a newborn daughter who died in 1965 due to medical complications. Afterward, he became more withdrawn from the community, living more reclusively and significantly reducing social relationships. Hospital records noted that Avery refused to participate in psychological therapy sessions for parents who lost children, a detail that could not be considered evidence, but indicated the possibility of prolonged psychological instability. Some former colleagues described Avery as quiet, often observing others from a distance, sometimes disappearing from work for a few days without explanation, then returning as if nothing happened. His erratic temperament and unstable travel history led Monroe to believe Avery was capable of committing an impulsive abduction or one driven by psychological motives related to losing his child. The investigator continued clarifying information about Avery's residences after 1966. Residence records showed he moved at least 3 times within 4 years, all to remote areas far from city centers and minimally monitored. This was consistent with the behavior of individuals wanting to avoid community attention. Monroe viewed the frequent moves after 1966 as a detail to track because it coincided with the time a suspect might want to distance himself from the area where the incident occurred. To strengthen his assessment, Monroe compared witness descriptions of the man in the green hat with descriptions of Avery in employment records. One colleague had noted in an internal report that Avery always wore an old green-gray baseball cap when working outdoors and rarely showed his thinning hair. This was a notable similarity, though not direct confirmation, but it reinforced the possibility that Avery was present in the neighborhood at the time of the incident. Monroe also checked Avery's vehicle records to determine the truck's condition in 1966. Although maintenance records from that time were incomplete, one receipt showed the right rear tire was replaced in late 1964 with a model whose specifications closely matched those recorded in the scene report. This led Monroe to believe Avery's truck not only matched in color and size, but also in the uneven wear pattern on the scene tracks. When compiling all the data, Monroe assessed Avery as the suspect with the highest match level in the entire list, superior to local owners who had clear schedules and alibis on the morning Sophia disappeared. Avery also stood out more than other unidentified owners due to his personal background, psychological instability after losing his child, habits of irregular appearances, and interstate travel capability. These factors, when connected, formed a behavioral pattern consistent with the hypothesis of an unfamiliar perpetrator appearing briefly, observing the target, then quickly leaving the area. No factor confirmed Avery as the perpetrator, but Monroe recognized that he met all the signs a key suspect needed when the agency lacked direct witnesses or identifying physical evidence. Therefore, Monroe proposed placing Thomas Avery on the primary suspect list, noting him as a subject to monitor and continue verifying, while recommending expanding information collection in the Wyoming area where Avery lived and worked, with the goal of finding additional data to support the investigative direction. When Thomas Avery was elevated to the core suspect group, Monroe shifted to the field investigation phase in Wyoming to verify the degree of alignment between the profile data and this man's real-life circumstances during the period around 1966. The first thing he did was collect Avery's residency data, including addresses where he had lived, moving dates, and any information related to travel between Colorado and Wyoming. Records from the county office showed that Avery lived in a sparsely populated residential area on the outskirts of the town of Rawlins in late 1966, then moved twice within 3 years, each time to areas with few neighbors and far from major traffic routes. The residency records did not clearly explain the reasons for these frequent changes, but they provided Monroe with a basic timeline to cross-reference with the data from Sophia's disappearance case. Once he obtained the list of addresses, he proceeded to contact neighbors who had lived near Avery during the relevant periods. The first group interviewed consisted of residents along the dirt road where Avery had lived in the final months of 1966. Several recalled that Avery was a very private person, with little social interaction and often returning home at unusual hours. What caught Monroe's attention was the account from an elderly woman who had lived in the house across the street. She remembered that around early 1967, Avery suddenly appeared with a very young child, approximately 1 to 2 years old. According to her, the child did not seem to be Avery's biological offspring because she had never heard of him having any surviving children after the death of his daughter in 1965. She described the toddler as having light blonde hair, rarely taken outside, and whenever it appeared, Avery always seemed vigilant when anyone looked over. These observations particularly interested Monroe because the child's age matched what Sophia's would have been if she were still alive at that time. However, since the witness's memory was based on events many years prior, it was impossible to pinpoint the exact timing of the child's appearance or the degree of physical resemblance. Monroe continued interviewing those living not far from Avery's home. A man who had briefly worked with Avery described him as often carrying a large bag and occasionally mentioning having to take care of someone without elaborating. This man did not see the child directly, but remembered that Avery declined extended meetings or jobs requiring long-distance travel, citing the need to return home early. Another witness, living farther back in the neighborhood, stated that he had once seen Avery carrying a child while passing through the backyard, but the timing and specific details were unclear. These accounts, though incomplete, formed a relatively consistent chain of information in the period following 1966. A young child appeared in Avery's home, which did not align with his known family profile. Monroe noted that the unusual appearance of a child in the home of a single man who had recently lost his own daughter could be a significant indicator, especially since it coincided with the disappearance of a little girl within a reasonable travel radius from Fort Collins. However, when cross-checking the statements, he found significant discrepancies in the witness information. Some said the child appeared in mid-1967, others insisted late 1966, and no one could recall the appearance precisely or describe it in enough detail to serve as evidence. After interviewing neighbors, Monroe proceeded to review medical records in the area to determine whether Avery had ever brought a child in for examination or vaccination. However, no record showed Avery's name associated with child care from 1966 to 1969. This could stem from Avery not taking the child to any medical facility or from incomplete records of that era, but it still left Monroe without direct evidence of a link. Continuing the investigation, he checked Avery's criminal and traffic records, but there were no serious violations in the relevant years, only a few speeding warnings. This indicated that Avery avoided drawing attention from authorities, consistent with the profile of someone capable of evading oversight. When compiling all the data, Monroe concluded that the neighbor statements formed a critical body of information the existence of a mysterious little girl appearing in Avery's home, not long after Sophia's disappearance. This chain of information, though lacking concrete evidence, was sufficient for Monroe to flag it as one of the most noteworthy leads in the Wyoming investigation phase. However, he also had to confront the reality that there was no direct proof, no photos, no documents, no medical records, no official confirmation that could prove the child's identity or link her appearance to the Colorado case. The absence of hard evidence compelled Monroe to note in his report that the Wyoming field investigation results only supported the hypothesis and could not be used to strengthen or charge the case. Although the gathered facts heightened suspicions toward Avery, the entire body of information remained at the suggestive level, not sufficient to turn suspicion into an investigative conclusion. Upon completing the witness interviews in Wyoming, but still lacking direct evidence, Monroe returned to Colorado to re-examine all the physical evidence stored since 1966, aiming to assess whether anything had been overlooked or could be reanalyzed using techniques available in 1970. The evidence storage room in Larimer County still held several items related to Sophia's disappearance, including crime scene photos, notes on tire track measurements, soil samples collected near the road edge, and a small bag containing pale-colored fabric fibers noted as recovered during supplemental search. Upon examining the fabric fiber sample, Monroe found it contaminated with numerous impurities and no longer traceable to its origin. The original report indicated the sample was collected at the end of the second search day, by which time the scene had been heavily disturbed by large numbers of people, rendering the likelihood of direct relevance to the disappearance virtually nil. There was no clear description of the exact location, no notes on discovery conditions, and no photos taken at the time of collection, leading Monroe to assess it as merely an item picked up from the search area under chaotic conditions, entirely insufficient for use as evidence. When re-reviewing the 1966 crime scene photos, he discovered many details poorly documented. Some tire track photos failed to fully capture the tread pattern due to angled shots, poor lighting, and no scale included for proportion verification. This significantly limited comparison with actual tire samples, forcing Monroe to rely almost entirely on the written descriptions from police at the time. Some scene notes like "no child footprints found" or "no items left behind" were very brief and did not describe ground conditions, weather, or disturbance levels, complicating reassessment of the initial observation's reliability. When cross-referencing the notes with actual circumstances, Monroe immediately recognized that the lack of standardized evidence collection procedures had created numerous gaps. For instance, no records clearly described tire track direction or whether multiple tracks were present in the area. This restricted accurate reconstruction of the vehicle's path, as a single tread mark alone cannot determine direction without a continuous sequence. Additionally, Monroe reviewed the 1966 witness statement reports and found several key details not included in the official file. For example, Mary had stated that the strange truck appeared multiple days before the incident, but the file only noted "strange vehicle seen near the neighborhood." This inaccuracy reduced the statement's value in determining the suspect's stalking extent. Another error was failing to record the exact timing when the neighbor boy saw the man in the green hat, making cross-referencing with Mary's entry time nearly impossible. When examining the preserved soil samples, Monroe noted they were no longer intact due to suboptimal storage. Some samples had dried and separated, completely losing analyzable compression levels or traces potentially from a child. This reinforced the conclusion that the era's evidence collection and storage system did not meet standards needed for long-term reinvestigation. Furthermore, some items listed in the 1966 inventory no longer existed in storage, including a piece of paper described as found in bushes but unclear whether related to the case or mere litter. The absence of this evidence highlighted risks of loss during storage, preventing Monroe from fully reviewing all physical elements. The overall results from re-evaluating the evidence showed that most had lost legal value or scientific analyzability, compelling Monroe to note that the 1966 scene file contained many weaknesses, incomplete photos, cursory scene descriptions, lacking supporting documents, and no verifiable measurement data. These errors contributed to explaining why the case stalled in the initial weeks. The evidence review allowed Monroe to clearly understand the original investigation's limitations and update an internal report with a list of errors, including improper scene preservation, non-standard photography, unclear vehicle direction determination, incomplete hot scene evidence collection, and imprecise witness information recording. These notes became a key part of the file's risk assessment and reflected the challenges of any reinvestigation effort based on old evidence. When the re-evaluation of physical evidence confirmed that no remaining physical data could help reconstruct the event or identify traces of Sophia for direct investigation purposes, Monroe shifted to analyzing the possibility that the victim was still alive based on the perpetrator's behavioral model. In the context of no body, no items left behind, no signs of violence, and no ransom demand, he considered a hypothesis that had appeared in some child abduction cases in Western states during the mid-20th century. Kidnapping a child to raise as a replacement for a lost biological child. This hypothesis became particularly noteworthy when compared to Avery's background, as he had lost his newborn daughter not long before Sophia disappeared. Monroe gathered research documents from that era, though not as systematized as in later decades, which still recorded several cases where women or men who had suffered major child loss carried out abductions of young children in a replacement manner. The common characteristics of these cases were no harm to the child, avoidance of medical contact, and choosing to live in isolated environments to avoid detection. When matching these characteristics with what he had gathered from Avery's neighbors, the appearance of a strange little girl, Avery rarely taking the child out, changes in his behavior, and frequent moves, Monroe concluded that the behavioral pattern fit a psychological abduction type more than one for ransom or violence. This meant the possibility that the victim was still alive after being taken was real, especially if the perpetrator had no motive to harm. To assess this further, Monroe examined the period from late 1966 to 1967-1968, the time when a Wyoming witness claimed to have seen a child in Avery's home. If this hypothesis was correct, the child could be Sophia, and the likelihood that the baby was cared for at a minimal level was high. The child in the neighbor's descriptions was said to rarely appear outside, which aligned with the perpetrator's model of avoiding outsiders, recognizing the presence of a new family member that didn't match family information. Additionally, Avery's multiple moves could be interpreted as efforts to maintain secrecy, especially since he had no wife or relatives living with him to legitimize the appearance of a child. In deeper analysis of this point, Monroe compared the behavioral model with the victim's survival risk factors. Since Sophia disappeared at age 1, if provided minimal care, including food, shelter, and suitable temperature, she could fully survive in a secluded environment without needing frequent medical contact. Cases of abductions for raising often noted that perpetrators avoided taking children to hospitals due to fear of detection through records, leading to the child not appearing in local medical files. This exactly matched Monroe's inability to find any medical records related to Avery and a child during his time in Wyoming. Beyond physiological survival chances, Monroe also evaluated Sophia's long-term survival potential in the context of the perpetrator's isolated lifestyle. The mountainous areas and sparse towns of Wyoming at that time were ideal environments for an individual to avoid social contact and maintain secrecy over a long period. Information from neighbors showed Avery did not participate in community activities, often worked independently, and avoided deep conversations, a behavioral style fitting someone wanting to conceal a child's presence. Based on these analyses, Monroe concluded that the raising abduction model not only fit the data, but could also explain the suspect's entire post-incident behavior. Therefore, he expanded the investigation direction toward psychology, examining factors that might drive an individual like Avery to commit abduction. He reviewed Avery's records to see if he had ever shown obsessive behavior, depression, or disorders related to family loss. Medical records noted Avery's breakdown after his daughter's death, along with his refusal of psychological support, further increasing the likelihood that he acted on a compensatory motive. People who knew Avery described him as often distracted, staring at young children in stores without speaking, a detail fitting the profile of someone inclined to fill emptiness by having a child again. When synthesizing this behavioral analysis block, Monroe reached the conclusion that assessing Sophia's survival possibility was reasonable based on the perpetrator's model. Though there was no direct evidence proving it, all indirect data allowed forming a provisional hypothesis. If the abductor had a replacement motive, the victim had a chance of living for a considerable time after being taken. At the same time, the psychological investigation direction opened a new prospect in determining the perpetrator's subsequent behavior and possible locations where the victim might have been taken. In 1992, more than 2 decades after Monroe's initial file review and identification of severe limitations from both physical evidence and witness data, the Larimer County Sheriff's Office launched a new cold case review under a statewide program to apply advanced identification techniques. Among the backlog cases, Sophia Hughes's case was selected due to its unique nature: disappearance at just 1 year old, no evidence of death, and the existence of a possibility that the victim was still alive based on perpetrator behavioral analysis. The investigator assigned this time, Miriam Blake, was tasked with reviewing the entire old file and determining which modern tools could provide value in reactivating the case. After studying the initial document volume, Blake noted that the age progression technique, recently widely promoted by the National Center for Missing Children, could create a new direction. Since Sophia disappeared when too young, with no photos at older ages, any past search efforts had been severely limited by the lack of visual imagination of the victim's current appearance. Therefore, Blake proposed creating a series of projected images at various ages, 10, 15, 20, and especially an image approximating age 27 in 1992, considered the most important for release to the public and federal agencies. To do this, Blake had to recollect all original photos of Sophia before disappearance, only a few family photos taken in her first year. The image progression specialists used these photos combined with parental genetic traits, including facial structure, eye and nose shape, facial bone ratios, and general age-related morphological development factors. Although the technology was still limited compared to later decades, the progressed images still created a relatively clear visualization of how the victim might look if alive at that time. When the image series was complete, Blake compiled and sent them to federal agencies like the FBI, INMEC, police departments in neighboring states, and hospital systems handling homeless or unidentified individuals. The image distribution was accompanied by a case summary file describing Sophia's original features and the reasons for suspecting the victim might still be alive. These materials were distributed much more widely than efforts in the 1960s and 1970s, thanks to the developing federal data exchange systems in the early 1990s. Blake also requested posting the images in internal bulletins of health and social welfare sectors in several western states, where many unidentified cases were often received. After a few months, most responses provided no value, mainly public misidentifications or overly general matching cases. However, one notable response emerged from Utah. A social worker in the town of Moab reported that Sophia's age 27 image looked very similar to a young woman living in a remote area, whom the local community occasionally saw, but no one knew her true identity. Only that she used the name Elena. This person had no school records, no birth certificate, and was described as having lived with an older man before he left the area a few years prior. When comparing the detail of an older man living with a young woman without documents, Blake immediately recognized significant similarity to the data Monroe had collected about Avery. Although there was no direct evidence showing Elena's connection to Avery or the Colorado disappearance, the overlap in residency pattern, identity mystery, and isolated living environment made the Utah information the most important signal since Sophia's disappearance. Blake immediately flagged this report as priority information and added to the file that this was the first time in over 25 years that data emerged about an adult woman potentially matching Sophia's projected description. Within the framework of the second cold case review, the Utah Signal officially opened a new investigation direction, beyond old hypotheses, and creating the first opportunity to verify the possibility that the victim was still alive in another state, with an unofficial identity and no recorded history in any civil system. When the Utah lead was identified as the most promising signal in years, Miriam Blake began implementing field investigation steps to verify the identity of the woman named Elena and assess her potential connection to Sophia Hughes's disappearance. The first thing Blake did was review all information Monroe had collected about Thomas Avery, especially residency addresses after his Wyoming period. Records showed Avery had moved to Utah in the late 1970s and lived in a sparsely populated area of San Juan County. Although residency records from that era were not detailed, Blake found some documents noting Avery had rented a small cabin near Moab for a few years before moving away. This information matched the social worker's report describing Elena as having lived with an older man in a remote area near Moab. With the first intersection point clear, Blake expanded searches to local data sources, county office records, medical reports, school lists, and community support organization notes. There were no civil or educational records under Elena Hart or any similar individual. This reinforced the hypothesis that Elena was undocumented, fitting the model of a kidnapped child raised outside the system. Blake contacted the social worker who sent the report, who stated Elena had appeared in the area from around the late 1980s and almost never interacted with public authorities. Elena often bought necessities with cash at a few local stores, avoided prolonged contact with strangers, and had no identification documents like ID cards, driver's license, or medical records. Local residents also described Elena as quiet, tending to isolate herself from the community, and seemingly without a clear family network. This was the type of behavior often seen in people raised under tight control, lacking social exposure, or basic knowledge of administrative procedures. Matching the hypothesis that Sophia might have lived for years in a closed environment, similar to the model Monroe described when analyzing perpetrator behavior. After identifying initial matching points, Blake moved to the next step, comparing Elena's appearance with Sophia's age progression images. The social worker described Elena as having light blonde hair, a petite build, a slender but slightly thin face, and especially rare gray-blue eyes, matching the image of Sophia at 1 year old. Blake requested compiling all descriptions related to Elena from people who had met her in town, including grocery store owners, local library staff, and a few residents who had seen her pass by. Though no one had direct photos because Elena avoided being photographed, consistent overlaps in hair color, eye color, and build appeared in accounts from multiple people. Notably, the grocery store owner remembered Elena, looking like someone unfamiliar with urban environments and seeming surprised by simple things like paperwork and forms, a sign she might have grown up outside education and administrative systems. When comparing descriptions to Sophia's adult progression images, Blake noted noteworthy similarities: facial bone structure, eye position, and chin shape all fell within the age progression model's predictions. Though not conclusive evidence, the match level was enough for Blake to note that Elena should be considered a key verification subject in the file. For further clarification, Blake examined the possibility that Avery had lived with Elena before leaving Moab. Some local residents provided information that the older man in the cabin near town rarely interacted with others and seemed to live only with a much younger girl. One witness described the girl as not seeming like a biological daughter, due to the vast age difference and the way the man behaved toward her more like a guardian than a father-child relationship. Additionally, they said her appearances were almost tied to Avery's presence. After he moved away, she disappeared from the area for a while, then sporadically reappeared in nearby small towns. When compiling this description chain, Blake noted that Avery's behavioral profile fully fit the model of a perpetrator raising the victim in isolation, avoiding social contact and limiting victim interaction with outsiders. Avery's residency pattern in Utah also mirrored the data Monroe collected in Wyoming, creating a multi-year behavioral chain. However, Blake was also aware that all data about Elena at this point was only civilian witness-based, with no absolute evidence proving she was Sophia. No photos, no genetic records, no public records from when she was young. The only thing present was the unusual overlap between appearance description, appearance timing, restricted social behavior, and possible connection to Avery. Comparing all these factors, Blake concluded that Elena Hart was a subject requiring identity verification at priority level. Though not yet affirmable, the strength of appearance and living circumstance matches was enough to expand the investigation, with determining Avery's former residences and Elena's appearance history in each area becoming the core task to clarify whether Elena could be Sophia. As the Utah profile began to take shape, and the matches between Elena and the age-progressed images of Sophia became increasingly evident, Blake sought ways to proceed with deeper verification steps to gather evidence confirming her identity. However, as soon as this process was initiated, numerous legal barriers emerged, preventing the investigation from advancing as hoped. The first and most critical issue was the inability to collect Elena's DNA sample. Since she was not a criminal suspect, had not been arrested, was not a victim of a crime at the time of discovery, and there was no legal basis to compel sampling. Blake had no authority to request her DNA without consent. The social worker who had interacted with Elena reported that she was highly wary of strangers and often refused any form of administrative approach. Requesting a DNA sample in such circumstances was nearly impossible, especially since Elena had no legal obligation to prove her identity. Any attempt to obtain a sample indirectly, such as collecting discarded personal items, would be restricted by privacy laws and Utah state laws, which strictly protect personal property and privacy rights. Blake was aware that if procedures were not followed correctly, any sample obtained would be deemed invalid in the investigation. The second barrier arose when Blake considered the possibility of searching the cabin where Avery had once lived. Although the cabin was mentioned in multiple local statements, it remained privately owned, and there was no specific evidence indicating it contained documents or physical evidence related to Sophia's disappearance. Under Utah law, to obtain a search warrant, investigators must demonstrate probable cause that evidence of a crime exists on the property. But Blake only had vague descriptions of a young girl living with Avery and the physical resemblance between Elena and the age-progressed images. These details were entirely insufficient to convince a court to issue a search warrant. At that time, the cabin was owned by a new landowner unrelated to Avery, who had no reason to allow police to conduct a thorough inspection. Trespassing or unauthorized access would not only violate the law, but could also invalidate the entire investigative direction if valuable evidence emerged later. The legal barriers meant Blake could only note the cabin as an indirectly related location, but could not take any decisive investigative actions there. The third major barrier was that Avery had left Utah many years earlier, making tracing him difficult and discontinuous. Residence records showed he moved out of Moab in the early 1980s and then disappeared from the administrative system for a long period. His social security number had no employment transactions, medical records showed no trace, and there were no vehicle registrations in his name in Utah after that point. This information prevented Blake from determining where Avery was living, whether he was still alive, or whether he had continued living with Elena for any period after leaving Moab. Local witnesses could only provide that Avery suddenly disappeared and did not return after leaving the cabin, but no one knew where he went or by what means. This disappearance completely severed the ability to trace the relationship between Avery and Elena in the final period before they separated. Any opportunity to discover whether Avery had left behind documents, photos, or evidence related to Elena was blocked by the inability to locate his last known residence. Blake also contacted Wyoming to check if Avery had returned to his previous residence, but records showed he did not re-register residency, file taxes, or have any interactions with the legal system. This left the investigation in a state of information shortfall. A central suspect vanished from the system, a potential victim whose identity could not be verified, and no access to any locations that might contain physical evidence. Additionally, Blake discovered that current regulations did not allow reopening a criminal investigation based solely on physical resemblance or uncorroborated civilian accounts. To proceed further, the investigation needed a legal foothold, a physical piece of evidence, a direct statement from someone involved, or a clear identity verification factor. None of these three conditions existed at the time of Blake's investigation. Unable to obtain Elena's DNA, search the cabin, or trace Avery, the Utah investigation reached its limit and was forced to pause. Blake concluded in his report that this investigative direction had potential but could not be developed further under the current legal and data conditions. Any additional efforts would only create loops of speculation without real value. This forced withdrawal meant that the Utah leads, though noteworthy, could not yet advance the case in any concrete way. The investigation once again fell into a state of limbo. A new direction existed but without the legal tools to pursue it fully, and the person holding the most critical key, Thomas Avery, had managed to leave Utah before any authorities could question him. Many years after the Utah investigation had to be halted due to legal barriers and Avery's disappearance severing all leads, an unexpected event reopened a door that seemed permanently closed. Thomas Avery's death record appeared in the federal system after a Nevada hospital reported the death of an unidentified homeless man in 1998. When fingerprints from old military records were matched, authorities confirmed the man was Avery. This information was immediately forwarded to Colorado due to its connection to an unsolved cold case, triggering a comprehensive reevaluation. Avery's death meant many past legal barriers no longer applied, particularly regarding searching abandoned property or assets. The cabin he had rented near Moab, once the biggest obstacle in the Utah investigation, was now owned by a new landowner who agreed to cooperate upon learning it might be linked to a decades-long child disappearance case. As a result, for the first time in over 30 years, investigators were able to enter the cabin and conduct an official on-site examination. The cabin was located deep in a remote area, with the access road covered in the characteristic red desert dirt of Utah. As the team approached, the wooden structure had deteriorated but still retained the shape of a secluded residence, fitting the isolated lifestyle described by witnesses. Inside, although most items had been damaged over time, some remained intact and valuable for comparison. In the corner of the main room, the team found a large wooden box containing many clipped and saved old newspapers, most notably an article about Sophia Hughes's 1966 disappearance, a detail that strongly fueled suspicions about a connection previously only speculated upon. The fact that a man not living in Colorado had kept a newspaper article about a disappearance in another state for many years was an abnormal and highly suggestive sign. Continuing the search of the cabin, the team discovered an old roll of film stored in a tin box. Most photos had faded, but a few were still identifiable. They showed Avery standing in front of the cabin next to what appeared to be a rolled-up children's play mat. Another photo, though unclear on the face, captured a small child standing in front of the cabin door, wearing a simple dress and facing away from the camera. Although identity could not be confirmed, the existence of photos of a child in Avery's cabin reinforced the Wyoming witnesses' claims that a little girl had once lived with him. Additionally, several children's items such as a low wooden chair, a small pale-colored wool blanket, and handmade wooden toys were found in aged but not completely ruined condition. These items did not match Avery's family records, which showed no children living with him after the death of his infant daughter in 1965. The presence of children's items many years later could not be explained by his personal history, creating a key piece in concluding that Avery had indeed cared for a child. The next significant clue appeared in a small unnamed notebook containing brief notes like "Don't let anyone see," "Leave early before anyone comes," "Stay quiet." written in hurried handwriting. None mentioned specific names or events, but the tone was clearly one of concealment. Though the notebook could not be considered legal evidence, it reflected the owner's state of vigilance and secrecy, consistent with descriptions of Avery's behavior years earlier. When compiling all the cabin's contents, the team noted that the items, old newspapers and photos, not only heightened suspicions, but clearly demonstrated a connection between Avery and a child during the extended period after the 1966 disappearance. However, an important conclusion was also reached: no physical evidence indicated the current whereabouts of that child. There were no identification documents, no clear facial photos, no personal items that could verify identity. The cabin only proved that Avery had once lived with a young child in the past, but revealed nothing about who that child was, where they came from, or where they went. Investigators also found no traces suggesting the cabin had been used for confinement or showed signs of violence. Instead, it bore signs of long-term, simple but adequate residence, fitting the pattern of abduction for raising analyzed by Monroe. In the final report, the team assessed that the cabin provided the strongest evidence to date of Avery's direct involvement in Sophia Hughes's disappearance, but also confirmed that the victim's whereabouts remained a complete blank. The cabin only demonstrated the existence of a child who had lived with Avery for many years, but provided no clues about that person's later location, leaving the investigation in continued ambiguity despite this significant step forward. After Avery left the Utah cabin and vanished from residence records, the woman known to the local community as Elena gradually detached from the last remnants of her isolated life. Without her sole guardian, no documents, no family, and no clear understanding of the outside world, Elena left the residence without leaving specific traces of the time or direction. The last residents who saw her described her packing a few essential items, an old cloth bag, thin clothing and miscellaneous belongings, then leaving the cabin one early morning on an unknown date. Though no one witnessed it directly, many believed she walked out of the remote area, as no vehicle was recorded leaving the cabin at that time. Abandoning the only place she had ever called home marked the beginning of a prolonged period of wandering, during which Elena moved sporadically through small Utah towns, taking odd jobs or temporarily staying in low-population areas in exchange for food or shelter. No authorities identified her during this phase because she never directly interacted with government agencies, sought medical care, applied for benefits, or used any public services. She existed on the margins, unknown by real name, age, or origin. Those who encountered her during that time described Elena as wary, even excessively cautious, always keeping distance from strangers, and communicating only in short sentences or gestures. This lifestyle continued until Elena began moving out of Utah eastward, possibly by hitchhiking or long-haul trucks. No official records confirmed her means of travel, but later scattered clues indicated appearances in Price, then Grand Junction in Colorado, before continuing to Denver. The choice of Denver, a large, populous city with many homeless support communities, may have stemmed from the need to blend into an environment where anonymity was easier. However, it's also possible Elena simply followed crowds or vehicles without specific direction. Upon arriving in Denver, she blended into the homeless population, living in areas near the city center, alongside immigrants, day laborers, and urban wanderers. No one in this community probed deeply into her identity. Lacking documents was not uncommon. Elena found shelter in temporary facilities, but often left before staff asked for personal information. When required to fill out forms, she responded with a head shake or meaningless scribbles, leading staff to assume communication disorders or literacy issues. Elena's health deteriorated due to inconsistent nutrition, irregular access to clean water, and no medical care for years. Finally, on a cold winter night, emergency responders found her unconscious near an abandoned bus stop. She was taken to a local hospital in a state of exhaustion, severe dehydration, and malnutrition. When asked her name, she could not respond. When asked to sign papers, she stared blankly into space without recognition. Thus, the hospital recorded her as Jane Doe, unidentified person. Doctors quickly noted she had no documents, no ID card, medical records, personal papers, or items that could help verify identity. Her clothing was old and thin, untraceable. The cloth bag contained only miscellaneous items without personal information. Hospital records noted she did not speak in full sentences, responded slowly, and showed signs of long-term neglect. However, there were no signs of violence or assault injuries. Her body reflected a long history of deprivation rather than abuse. When hospital social workers tried to ask about previous residences, Elena only repeated meaningless syllables, making information gathering impossible. This silence was not defiance, but a protective reflex from years lived in fear of discovery, being returned to an old place, or controlled by others. With no leads to identify her, the hospital was required to report an adult unidentified Jane Doe to the state system, a standard procedure for such cases. But no one at the hospital knew that this simple administrative entry would become the first intersection between Elena and modern databases, a system that by the time of her admission was linked to federal identification networks. In a context where no one knew where she came from, what she had lost, or what had been taken from her life, Elena, the nameless, paperless, voiceless victim, had officially entered an identification system she had never encountered before. And though she was unaware of it, that moment marked the beginning of a data integration process that would bring the Sophia Hughes disappearance investigation back into the light after nearly half a century of being forgotten. When Elena, recorded in the Denver hospital records as Jane Doe, was transferred to long-term care, the standard administrative procedures for unidentified patients began to be implemented. One of the most important steps was collecting a DNA sample for entry into the national system, in case any agency was searching for a missing person or a family had reported a relative as missing. This process had become more common in the early 2000s compared to the previous decade, especially for adults with no form of identification whatsoever. The sampling was done simply. A cotton swab was rubbed inside Elena's cheek. She did not object, showed no anxiety, and displayed no understanding of what was happening. Her reaction was that of someone accustomed to others making decisions for her. The sample was then sealed and sent to the Colorado State Lab for entry into CODIS, the national DNA database. In most Jane Doe cases, this process rarely yielded results, as the majority of unidentified individuals had no genetic profiles in the system. But just a few weeks after the DNA sample was entered, an unusual alert appeared at the analysis center. Elena's DNA profile showed a partial match with genetic material belonging to a Colorado family that had submitted DNA in the late 1980s as part of a pilot program for long-term missing persons cases. That profile was under the name Hughes. Lab staff initially assumed it was a random coincidence, since the Hughes family profile had lain dormant in the system for years without any hits. But upon deeper analysis, they discovered the degree of similarity fell within a rare range, not enough to confirm direct blood relation, but too high to dismiss as mere chance. Strangely, the match only appeared in certain genetic markers, consistent with the errors or missing data common in older samples collected before standardization. The Hughes family DNA profile had been entered into CODIS in 1989, just 2 years after the system began experimental use for missing persons identification. At that time, only Sophia's mother, Mary Hughes, and a close relative had provided samples, making the family dataset incomplete by modern standards. Therefore, the detection of a partial match, though lacking legal weight to confirm identity, had sufficient statistical significance to trigger a case review protocol. The system automatically sent an alert to Colorado's Missing Persons DNA Management Agency, noting that a Jane Doe in Denver had a partial match with a profile from 1966. This notification was then forwarded to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in accordance with procedures for potential long-term missing persons cases. When the file reached CBI, the cold case team immediately noticed the name Sophia Hughes appearing in the related listings. Even though it was only a partial match, the composite characteristics of the case, an adult unidentified woman with no documents, no civil history, appearing in Colorado, made it impossible for CBI to ignore. Another important factor was noted: the Jane Doe had appeared in Denver, less than a 2-hour drive from Fort Collins, in the same state where Sophia disappeared. Although it could not be considered evidence, the fact that the potential victim did not appear in some random state, but specifically in the state of the original incident, was evaluated as a noteworthy factor in statistical analysis. CBI analysts reviewed the hospital reports and noted many characteristics matching the pattern Monroe and Blake had previously described: lack of social communication skills, no administrative knowledge, no identification documents, no knowledge of her real name, and signs of having lived for years without contact with public authorities. All of this supported the hypothesis that if the victim had been abducted as a young child and lived in isolation, such manifestations could fully emerge in adulthood. CBI requested additional medical information from the hospital, including photographs of the Jane Doe. When comparing these photos to the 1992 age progression image of Sophia, although not a perfect match, the analysis team noted unusually high similarity in facial bone structure and morphological features for complete strangers. Concurrently, the CODIS report was reanalyzed to confirm the partial match was not due to technical error. After cross-checking, the lab confirmed the match results were accurate, though not sufficient to determine identity, strong enough not to be dismissed as statistical error. With two data sources, DNA and projected images, both pointing to the same possibility, CBI officially reopened the investigation into the disappearance of Sophia Hughes. This meant that all records from 1966, Monroe's notes from the 1970s, and Blake's reports from the early 1990s were brought back to the analysis table. The Jane Doe DNA sample not only created an initial biological connection, but also became the first scientifically grounded turning point in the search for Sophia after nearly half a century. Although no one dared to confirm her identity yet, this match was sufficient to elevate the case to a higher investigation level, focusing entirely on determining whether the Denver Jane Doe was truly the child who vanished from the Hughes family yard in 1966. The appearance of this DNA sample, though only probabilistic, for the first time created a concrete bridge between the unidentified victim and the Hughes family, something that had never occurred in 46 years. When CBI received the report of a partial DNA match between the Denver Jane Doe and the Hughes family profile, the Sophia Missing Persons file was transferred to the Special Investigations Unit handling long-pending cases. Veteran investigator Jonathan Whitaker, who had experience reconstructing cases spanning decades, was given full authority to review all related documents. He began by requesting complete extracts of the records from 1966, including crime scene reports, witness statements, tire track photos, lists of suspect vehicles, and notes from the initial investigation. Next, he reviewed investigator Monroe's reports from the 1970s, noting the analysis of the escape direction toward Wyoming and the emergence of suspect Thomas Avery. Then, he studied Miriam Blake's 1992 materials, which documented the age progression efforts and clues arising from Utah regarding a woman named Elena. Finally, he cross-referenced the latest CODIS file, where the Denver Jane Doe's DNA sample indicated a potential biological link to the Hughes family. All data spanning 46 years lay before him like a series of scattered puzzle pieces, with each investigation phase yielding only partial information and never previously linked into a complete narrative. Whitaker's goal was to construct a single timeline, a comprehensive logical thread to assess whether the events over 4.5 decades were truly connected or merely isolated coincidences. Whitaker started the timeline with the core event, the day Sophia Hughes disappeared in Fort Collins, Colorado, in 1966. From there, he mapped the initial data points, tire tracks near the disappearance site, witness descriptions of a man in a green hat, and statements about a light-colored pickup truck leaving the area at unusual speed. He marked this as a deliberate and rapid escape from the scene phase. Next, he moved to the data Monroe collected in the 1970s. Monroe had analyzed that the vehicle likely left Colorado heading north to Wyoming in a short time. Whitaker re-examined traffic maps from that era and found Monroe's proposed route entirely plausible: few checkpoints, low traffic density, and easy blending into interstate flow. He added to the timeline the point where Avery appeared in Wyoming just months after the disappearance, noting that Avery had no prior ties to Fort Collins. This was significant, as it reinforced the hypothesis that the perpetrator was not local. Whitaker reviewed neighbor statements from Wyoming, indicating Avery lived with a small child during 1966-1967. These statements lacked precise timing, but consistently described a girl aged 1 to 2, matching Sophia's age. He placed this in the timeline as the appearance of an unidentified child. Though lacking direct evidence, the timing and circumstances gave this data considerable weight. From Wyoming, Whitaker shifted to Utah based on Avery's late 1970s residency records. This was where the first witness described a young woman with no documents living with an older man in a remote cabin near Moab. The 1992 investigation revealed this woman was called Elena, not her birth name, and behaved like someone isolated since childhood. Whitaker marked this as the Utah phase of the timeline, where the unidentified child from Wyoming may have become the adult undocumented woman. He cross-checked ages. If Sophia were alive, she would be over 20 when appearing in Moab, matching social worker descriptions of Elena in the early 1990s. Whitaker reviewed Blake's analysis, noting Elena shared many features with the age progression image: eye color, hair color, facial structure, and even build. All were added to the timeline as supporting factors, though not yet evidence. Next, Whitaker added the point where Avery left Utah and vanished, a key marker as it signaled when Elena lost her support and began leaving Utah. The timing was not precisely documented, but Whitaker placed it in the timeline as an unsupervised transition phase, common in victims raised outside the system. From there he traced Elena's sporadic trail as she moved through small towns to Colorado, based on vague civil reports and community assistance center records. At the end of the timeline, Whitaker recorded the pivotal event, Elena's admission to a Denver hospital, as Jane Doe and her DNA entry into CODIS. The biological analysis unit then detected a partial match with the Hughes family profile. This was the first data point in the entire 46 years that was scientific, independent of witness memory or behavioral speculation. With the timeline complete, Whitaker began linking everything into a single logical thread. He viewed each phase as layers of information: a child disappearing from Fort Collins, a strange man leaving Colorado toward Wyoming, a child appearing in that man's home shortly after the disappearance, an adult undocumented woman living with him in Utah decades later, and finally, a Denver Jane Doe with partial DNA matching the Hughes family. This sequence of events, when placed in chronological order, no longer appeared as scattered fragments, but began forming a continuous story. Whitaker noted that every major node in the timeline tied to Avery, directly or indirectly. This connection was strong enough to build an overall model. The perpetrator fled the scene in a truck, took the child to Wyoming, raised the child in isolation, moved to Utah with the now adult child, and then, when the perpetrator died or left, abandoned the child to survive with a false identity. Whitaker's internal conclusion was that, for the first time in nearly half a century, all data from Colorado, Wyoming, Utah to Denver, in timing, location, individuals, and identifying characteristics, had formed a single logical chain, unified enough to reopen the file toward verifying the Jane Doe's identity and assessing the high likelihood that she was Sophia Hughes. When Whitaker completed the comprehensive timeline and concluded that the Denver Jane Doe was highly likely to be Sophia Hughes, the next step for CBI was to verify identity using scientifically valid legal methods. Since the initial DNA profile only showed a partial match, insufficient for a conclusion, CBI decided to employ a new technique beginning to be applied in the 2000s: forensic genealogy, combining genealogical DNA analysis with expanded genetic databases to trace distant relatives. This method required examining not just direct parent-child relations, but identifying connections to more distant relatives based on shared genetic marker segments. It was a complex and time-consuming technique, but suitable for Sophia's case, as the Hughes family no longer had enough direct line members for standard direct comparison. The Jane Doe's DNA sample was reanalyzed in greater detail, separating autosomal DNA segments and comparing each to a database containing hundreds of thousands of samples from cold cases and family submissions through federal programs. Results showed several genetic segments with unusually high matches to distant relatives in the Hughes lineage, individuals who had uploaded DNA to commercial genealogy services and later shared it with investigators under new regulations. Although not a full match like parent-child, the similarity level between Jane Doe and Hughes branches was too high to be random. On the pedigree chart, the algorithm determined Jane Doe shared maternal line ancestry with Mary Hughes, indicating a real genetic connection to Sophia's maternal line. To reinforce results, the team turned to mtDNA. Mitochondrial DNA passed almost unchanged through the maternal line. This is a strong marker for long-term missing persons cases, as nuclear DNA may degrade or fragment over time, while mtDNA remains highly stable. Comparing mtDNA from Mary Hughes's hair sample to Jane Doe's yielded a 100% match, a level strong enough to confirm they shared the same maternal lineage. This did not automatically prove Jane Doe was Sophia, but ruled out her being completely unrelated. It placed Jane Doe among those with direct or close blood ties to Mary, narrowing possibilities to a very small number. Since Mary had only one daughter, Sophia, this made Jane Doe the near-certain candidate. However, CBI needed one final layer of comparison: anthropological identification, combining morphological analysis, physical characteristics, and markers independent of DNA. Experts were brought to the hospital to observe Jane Doe directly, comparing her to childhood photos of Sophia and adult projections. One feature noted immediately was a small birthmark behind the left ear, a detail Mary described in the 1966 file, but not widely publicized. This increased comparison value, as a perpetrator or outsider would have no reason to know it. Next, cheekbone shape, eyebrow arch, and inner eye distance were analyzed via recognition software. Despite decades passing, some facial ratios remained stable. Results showed Jane Doe fell within the variation range expected for Sophia if she aged normally. Notably, the gray-blue eyes, a rare trait and clear in Sophia's childhood photos, were present in Jane Doe almost identically. To avoid bias, CBI conducted acoustic lip shape and dental arch analysis, a supplementary technique for undocumented identity cases. Though Jane Doe spoke little and responded slowly, her jaw structure was compared to a 1965 family photo of young Sophia smiling. Results showed similarity in slightly misaligned teeth on the left, a genetic trait not common. Concurrently, psychological experts evaluated Jane Doe's behavior, noting that when hearing syllables close to so, she paused for seconds, as if touching a deeply suppressed vague memory. This could not be evidence but aligned with behavior in those separated from family very young and raised in limited communication environments. When all analyses were compiled, Whitaker requested one final comparison, a full genealogical DNA map of Jane Doe, placing her among Hughes' extended family branches. When the pedigree algorithm finished, only one position fit best: daughter of Mary Hughes. No other statistical possibility could explain the genetic match level, complete mtDNA sequence, and identifying features. From this, CBI reached the official conclusion, signed by the chief forensic examiner and approved by the state's special board: the Denver Jane Doe was Sophia Hughes, the child missing since 1966 at age 1. The name Elena Hart, randomly assigned by the community, was merely a temporary shell during her years of undocumented existence. This confirmation closed a major chapter in the 46-year investigation, marking the first time since 1966 that forensic genealogical, genetic, and identification systems all agreed the victim had survived and been found. When Jane Doe's identity was confirmed as Sophia Hughes, the next step for the CBI was to reconstruct Thomas Avery's lifelong behavioral profile to explain how he could abduct, raise and manipulate the victim for 46 years without detection. Whitaker continued to lead the special analysis team, this time focusing not on the victim but on the perpetrator, the only individual who could shed light on the cross-state chain of events, spanning nearly half a century. Reconstructing Avery's behavioral profile began with analyzing motive, a central factor in every non-ransom abduction. Wyoming hospital records showed that Avery's newborn daughter died in 1965, just 1 year before Sophia's disappearance. Those who knew him described a prolonged period of psychological instability, changes in behavior, withdrawal from the community, and an obsession with young children. Monroe had hypothesized years earlier that this was the type of behavior consistent with the replacement child abduction pattern, a form of crime in which the perpetrator does not intend harm, but seeks to fill a psychological void by possessing a new child. Whitaker re-examined this hypothesis in light of the new DNA information and concluded that it was no longer speculation, but the most reasonable explanation for Avery's entire conduct. Unlike violent abductions, Avery left no signs of conflict at the scene, caused no injury to the victim, and made no contact with the Hughes family, indicating that his motive was unrelated to finances or revenge. Avery's subsequent behavior after leaving Colorado also reinforced this hypothesis. He immediately took the victim out of state, chose Wyoming, a more remote area, and lived with the child in an environment with minimal social contact. Neighbor interview records from Wyoming, previously deemed vague, now carried significant weight once DNA confirmed the victim was Sophia. Multiple witnesses describing the appearance of a young girl in Avery's home in 1967 perfectly matched Sophia's age at that time. Whitaker marked this as the first phase in Avery's movement timeline, the Wyoming phase, the period when he concealed the victim by living reclusively and limiting contact. The second phase began when Avery left Wyoming and moved to Utah in the late 1970s. From a behavioral perspective, this move was not random. Perpetrators in the replacement category often abandon residences every few years when they sense a risk of detection or when the child grows older and draws more attention. The cabin in Moab, where Avery lived for many years with Elena, reflected the optimal residence for someone seeking absolute control over the victim. Isolated, hard to access, unsupervised, Whitaker noted the Utah phase as the most critical in the victim's journey. This was the period when Sophia lived through her entire childhood and adolescence in isolation, resulting in her having no documentation, no knowledge of her true identity, no access to education, and no full development of social skills. When comparing this behavior to documented criminal patterns in national records, Whitaker found clear similarities. Perpetrators completely isolate the victim to maintain control and avoid detection. The cabin records searched after Avery's death provided substantial evidence supporting this movement timeline. Clipped old newspaper articles about Sophia's disappearance confirmed that Avery was always fully aware of the child's origins. Children's items, including a small chair, wool blanket, and wooden toys, indicated the cabin had been used as a long-term residence for a child, not a temporary hideout. In particular, the blurry roll of film capturing an image of a young girl standing in front of the cabin was a rare visual piece of evidence, proving the victim's presence during the Utah phase. Though the face was unclear, the body size and posture matched Sophia's age at that time. Whitaker assessed that the evidence in the cabin not only confirmed the victim's presence, but also reflected how Avery raised and managed her. Short notes in a notebook, "Don't let anyone see," "Leave early before anyone comes," did not name names, but revealed the perpetrator's mindset. He lived in fear of discovery, which led him to maintain high control and complete separation of the victim from society. This was a form of behavior that sustained the cycle of abuse by creating absolute dependence. The victim knew nothing of the world beyond the cabin, no legal rights, no true name or origins. The third phase in the timeline began when Avery left Utah around the early 1980s. Whitaker called this the loss of guardianship phase. According to his analysis, Avery's disappearance could stem from three causes: declining health, fear of detection, or personal conflicts, forcing him to abandon the cabin. Though the true reason could no longer be verified, what happened next was clear. Sophia, now using the name Elena, began a wandering life with no one to support or supervise her. Lacking social skills, documentation, or resources, she was forced to leave the cabin and move instinctively, leading to her appearance in Denver and subsequent hospitalization in a state unaware of her identity. When Whitaker pieced these three phases into a comprehensive timeline, he found they aligned with all the scattered data collected over 46 years, from the Wyoming leads to the Utah cabin and ending in Denver. There were no longer any contradictions with the DNA data or identity cross-checks. One final question remained: whether there was direct evidence linking the cabin to the victim. Whitaker reviewed the cabin photos, children's items, old clippings, and notes, and concluded that although there were no documents naming the victim, the nature of these items pointed to a years-long relationship between Avery and an unidentified child, a connection that could only be explained by Avery being the abductor. With all the data organized, Whitaker compiled Avery's final behavioral profile: a man devastated by the loss of his child, abducting a young girl with replacement motive, moving across states to evade detection, raising the victim in isolation, and ultimately abandoning her when he himself deteriorated or could no longer maintain control. The complete behavioral profile for the first time painted a seamless picture of nearly half a century of mystery, all leading to one point: Avery was the central figure in the entire timeline, and the Utah cabin was the place establishing the strongest evidentiary link between the perpetrator and the victim. After completing Avery's behavioral profile and confirming he was the central link in the entire 46-year timeline, Whitaker turned to a lingering question from 1966. The man in the green hat, who appeared in the neighborhood just before Sophia's disappearance. For decades, this detail had been treated as supplementary testimony, insufficient to develop into an independent investigative lead. But with the new context, Sophia confirmed alive, Avery proven as the direct perpetrator, Whitaker considered the possibility that Avery did not act alone. Some child abductions for replacement purposes in the 1960s had recorded accomplice involvement, often someone assisting with surveillance, distraction, or helping the perpetrator access the target area without drawing attention. This prompted Whitaker to reanalyze the 1966 witness statements more seriously, particularly the neighbor boy's description of a man in a green baseball cap standing near the Hughes home before the disappearance. At the same time, Mary Hughes had described seeing a stranger in a green hat appearing multiple times in the neighborhood in the days leading up to the incident. The repetition of the green hat detail led Whitaker to view it as no longer coincidental. From there, he began reviewing residency records, employment records, and criminal data around the Fort Collins area from 1965, 1967, to find a man matching the witness description and potentially linked to Avery. After weeks of data review, one name emerged: Robert Hale, a freelance worker who had jobs in northern Colorado in 1966. Local police records noted Hale had been fined several times for disorderly conduct and warned for loitering in neighborhoods without clear reason. Notably, Hale was described in two separate reports as always wearing a light green baseball cap and having a habit of standing and observing in front of homes without approaching anyone. These descriptions matched significantly with the witness accounts. When viewing old photos, Whitaker noted that Hale and Avery did not resemble each other. This reinforced the possibility that the man in the green hat was not Avery, but potentially another individual present in the area with a specific role. Whitaker dug deeper by cross-referencing Hale's movement history. Employment records showed Hale had seasonal work in Wyoming for several months in 1967. This was a notable overlap. Avery was confirmed residing in Wyoming just months after the abduction, and the fact that both men appeared in the same state during a similar period led Whitaker to hypothesize they might have known each other. Tax and temporary residency data indicated Hale had been in Laramie and Rawlins, the very areas Monroe had investigated when interviewing Avery's neighbors. Though there was no direct evidence proving the two had met, Their presence in the same remote counties in close proximity could not be dismissed as pure coincidence. Whitaker also checked Hale's criminal records in Utah, given the possibility he followed Avery there. However, Utah data showed no legal interactions for Hale after 1968. This led to the necessary step, verifying Hale's status. After multiple queries, Whitaker located a death record for a Robert Hale matching the birth year and identifying features from the Colorado file. Hale died in 1979 in Idaho in a traffic accident, with the body identified via fingerprints and no criminal suspicions. Records also noted he lived alone, with no family, leaving no assets or personal documents. This made tracing Hale's past behavior nearly impossible. Though Hale was no longer alive for questioning, Whitaker continued analyzing the possibility he was Avery's accomplice. Based on 1960s crime patterns, accomplices in replacement child abductions typically had limited roles, such as surveillance, observation, or distraction, but not directly raising the victim. If Hale had assisted Avery, his role likely occurred only in the preparation and execution phases of the abduction. However, there was no post-event data, no leads linking Hale to the Utah cabin, no evidence he lived with a child, and no documents or images recovered from the cabin matching handwriting or fingerprints to Hale. Thus, the connection between Hale and the abduction remained at the level of possibility, unable to become legal evidence. Whitaker concluded that Hale could have been the observer in the days before Sophia's disappearance, based on the green hat description and loitering behavior around the neighborhood. But he could not assert Hale's direct involvement in the abduction, as there was no physical data or witness confirmation linking Hale and Avery on the day of the event. After reviewing all data, the CBI officially noted Robert Hale died in 1979, so he could not be questioned or held accountable. Though the matches in description and movement history made Hale a potential secondary suspect, his file was closed there, insufficient evidence to determine a role, but also not enough to fully rule him out. Whitaker noted in the final report, the man in the green hat may have been Hale, or may not, but whoever it was, his role, if any, no longer affects the case's primary conclusion. Avery is the sole perpetrator with direct evidence linking to the victim. The investigation into potential accomplices ended in the typical state of long-term cold cases. Many hypotheses, little evidence, and the suspect long deceased, unable to provide further clarification. But though Hale could not be pursued, defining the scope of his possible role helped narrow hypotheses, reinforcing the assessment that the abduction was Avery's initiative, and the man in the green hat, whether related or not, was not a determining factor in the victim's entire timeline. When all forensic, genealogical, and identity cross-check analyses reached a firm conclusion that the Jane Doe in Denver was Sophia Hughes, the CBI faced an equally complex and critical step, preparing to notify the victim's family, who had lived nearly half a century without answers. This process could not be rushed, as it involved legal obligations, psychological responsibilities, and the requirement for absolute identity authenticity before approaching relatives. Whitaker began by determining which Hughes family members were still alive. Archived records showed Sophia's father had died in the late 1970s, while her mother, Mary Hughes, was still living in Colorado, now in her 70s, with less than stable health. Whitaker contacted the Civil Records Office to verify Mary's current address, while also checking for any siblings or close relatives who had assisted in the investigation in prior years. A niece of Mary's, now living in Boulder, was the only one maintaining regular contact with her and had provided DNA in a supplemental sampling round in the 1980s. The CBI decided she would serve as the supporting family member in the notification process. Identifying surviving relatives was just the first step. Next, the CBI had to prepare a complete legal dossier for the notification to proceed according to standards. A comprehensive report was compiled with full sections, summary of the 1966 case, 46-year timeline, multi-layer DNA analysis results, mtDNA cross-check, forensic genealogy conclusion, and morphological identity assessment. Each section included citations, clear data sources, and descriptions of legal certainty levels. This report had to be robust enough not only to inform the family, but also to update national missing persons records, confirm legal identity restoration for Sophia, and prepare for subsequent victim support steps. Additionally, the CBI prepared a separate set of materials for the family. Explanations of the identification steps in plain language, comparison images between young Sophia and Jane Doe, and a summary of the nearly half-century search process. All were presented cautiously to avoid shock or misunderstanding, especially since Mary had lived for years believing her daughter might be gone. Once the legal dossier was complete, the next step was planning the meeting between the victim and family. The CBI's psychological support team joined this phase to assess two factors: Sophia's mental state, having grown up in isolation with no concept of biological family, and Mary's capacity to receive the information, given her age and potential strong emotional impact. Experts agreed the meeting could not happen immediately, but required layered preparation. First, Sophia needed psychological support to understand her true identity had been confirmed. Next, Mary needed gradual notification to avoid psychological shock. Whitaker planned the notification in 3 steps. Step 1. Meet the niece to present findings. Step 2. Consult with the hospital psychologist treating Sophia to assess receptivity. Step 3. Arrange a direct meeting with Mary in a controlled medical environment. Another key preparation was direct recognition potential. Though DNA confirmed Sophia's identity, the CBI still had to ensure the meeting followed legal recognition standards. Relatives must have the opportunity to cross-check identifying marks, such as physical features, birthmarks, and signs recorded in the missing child file. This was not to re-verify DNA, but to allow the family direct witnessing and establish an emotional connection before entering the affective phase. Whitaker prepared a private meeting room at the hospital where Sophia was inpatient. Requirements included no media, no leaks, and no presence of anyone outside the investigation and medical care teams. Hospital security was notified to control the area, ensuring absolute privacy. In parallel, Whitaker coordinated with the CBI legal team to prepare necessary documents for restoring Sophia's legal identity, including an official declaration that Jane Doe is now identified as Sophia Hughes, updates to Social Security and civil records. These documents would not be signed or released until family direct confirmation. When all materials were complete, the CBI contacted the niece to schedule the first meeting. She was brought to a private room at CBI, where Whitaker presented the full process from 1966 to the present, DNA results, and the final identification board decision. The niece, though overwhelmed by the information, immediately agreed to serve as the bridge between investigators and Mary. An appointment was set the following week for Mary's official notification. Throughout preparation, Whitaker noted in the internal report that this phase was the most sensitive of the case, as it involved not just legal procedures, but could determine how the victim and family reconnect after nearly half a century. Finally, with the schedule set, dossiers ready, and psychological support fully prepared, the CBI entered the final completion phase, arranging the meeting the Hughes family had awaited for 46 years, though no one could predict the emotions that would unfold when the truth was finally revealed before them. The date of the reunion was chosen carefully, after numerous psychological evaluations and thorough preparation from both the CBI and the medical team. Although DNA had confirmed that Jane Doe was Sophia Hughes, the in-person meeting still had to fully comply with the final identification process to ensure absolute legal transparency. Mary Hughes, now over 70, in frail health but with a sharp mind, was brought to Denver Hospital by her granddaughter and a psychological support specialist. Before entering the meeting room, she was explained that the woman she was about to meet had lived without documents or identity for decades, bearing deep psychological trauma and possibly remembering nothing related to the family. Nevertheless, Mary said that just knowing her daughter was alive was enough. In the hospital room, Sophia was prepared in a gentle and non-agitating manner. She was not described in advance about the person she was about to meet. She was only told that an old acquaintance wanted to visit to ensure she felt as comfortable as possible. The medical team selected the quietest room in the ward, dimmed the harsh lights to avoid overwhelming her, and arranged the chairs in a closed circle, so Sophia would not feel pressured or surrounded. When Mary entered, Sophia was sitting on the edge of the bed, her gray-blue eyes directed toward the door as a defensive reflex. Her frame was small and thin, her hands clasped tightly together, head slightly tilted to one side, a posture familiar in those who had lived in environments with limited communication. Mary paused for a few seconds before stepping closer, not wanting to startle her. The heavy weight of nearly half a century of waiting made her legs tremble, but she still advanced, stopping a few steps away. According to the identification process, the first step was to compare personal markers. An investigator gently asked Sophia if she could brush her hair to one side. Sophia hesitated but complied, and as soon as the hair shifted, the small birthmark behind her left ear, recorded in the 1966 missing person file, became clearly visible. Mary raised her hand to her mouth, choking back emotion, but did not step closer. She allowed the team to follow proper procedure, even though in her heart she had already recognized the unmistakable mark. The next step was to check another feature, a faint pigmented mole on the right wrist, noted by the pediatrician when Sophia was young. The medical specialist gently asked if Sophia could extend her hand. She hesitated for a few seconds, then opened it. The small mole, in the exact position and size as described in the records, was clearly evident. At this point, Mary could no longer hold back. She took one step forward, but still maintained distance to avoid pressuring her daughter. According to the morphological comparison process, the forensic specialist continued examining facial bone structure. A printout of Sophia as a child was placed on the table. They pointed out similarities in the high cheekbones, straight nose bridge, and slightly drooping eye folds toward the outer corners, distinct genetic traits that age progression images had also predicted. Each marker was documented in the identification report, combined with DNA data and legal records. At this stage, the process was nearly complete. The only remaining step was the final sensory verification, as required. The direct family member must be allowed to observe the victim in a natural, unforced state to provide direct confirmation. The room fell silent as Mary took another step, standing in front of Sophia, but not touching her. Her gaze trembled, but was full of patience. She did not want to frighten her daughter. Sophia, who always looked down or away when approached, unexpectedly lifted her head. Her gray-blue eyes met Mary's eyes, etched with the marks of time. In that brief moment, as an unconscious reaction, Sophia tilted her head to the left, a gesture Mary had described her daughter often making when curious as a child. Mary burst into tears, but did not move closer. She let the legal specialist ask the final question, "Do you confirm that this is your daughter, Sophia Hughes?" Missing since 1966, based on the personal markers and direct identification, Mary placed her hand on her chest, trying to stay composed, and said softly but clearly, "Yes, this is my daughter." The confirmation was recorded in the report, marking the completion of the legal identification process that had not had the chance to be carried out for nearly half a century. Sophia did not react strongly to the exchange, but she did not turn away. She looked at Mary for a few more seconds, then down at her own hands, as if trying to grasp something beyond her ability to express. The psychologists noted this as an appropriate response for someone deprived of family reference from a very early age. No clear recognition, but also no rejection. When the report was signed, the CBI officially closed the identification phase with a unified conclusion: DNA confirmed, MIT DNA affirmed, physical identification matched, and direct family recognition. Sophia Hughes was no longer the nameless Jane Doe, no longer the undocumented Elena. The identity lost in 1966 had been fully restored under legal light. The reunion, though weighed down by a 46-year gap, had taken place in a way few could imagine: cautious, thoroughly verified, and silently overwhelming. But even though Sophia's reaction remained vague, the identification process was complete, officially marking the transition from an unnamed victim to a person returned to her true identity. Immediately after the direct identification process was completed, and Sophia Hughes was officially confirmed before the law, the CBI entered an equally important phase, restoring the victim's legal identity, which had been erased from the system for nearly half a century. This was not just administrative procedure, it was the foundation for Sophia to access healthcare benefits, Social Security, legal protection, and all public services she had never enjoyed in her life. The first step was re-registering her identity. The CBI coordinated with the Colorado Office of Vital Records to restore Sophia Hughes's birth certificate based on archived records from 1965 and DNA confirmation. A new copy of the birth certificate was created, clearly stating the name Sophia Hughes, date of birth, place of birth, and biological parents' names. In the legal notes section, it stated, "Identity reconfirmed in 2012 following genetic testing and direct identification." This was a rare case in Colorado state history, where a person presumed missing since childhood had full citizenship rights restored in adulthood. Next was the step of invalidating the false identity Elena Hart, which in reality had never existed in the system. However, this still needed to be handled because Elena Hart had appeared in some social and medical records in Utah. The CBI sent notifications to the state of Utah, requesting updates to records to remove this name from all official systems, noting that it was not the true identity and had been verified as a consequence of the victim living undocumented. Hospital records that had used the name Elena were corrected, updated to Sophia Hughes, confirmed 2012. This ensured that all future documents related to health, treatment, and welfare benefits would not face obstacles due to the existence of an invalid identity. Another issue to address was updating national systems. Sophia Hughes's record in the missing persons system, opened in 1966 and maintained through multiple updates, had to be marked as found. This was a symbolic but technically important step, as it would stop all federal databases from automatically cross-referencing new reports with Sophia's file. NAMUS, NCIC, and CODIS all received official notifications from the CBI. In NCIC, Sophia's status code was changed from missing, endangered to recovered, living. In NAMUS, the case was marked closed, with notes on DNA and identification. CODIS updated the victim's profile from missing person to identified, while marking the genetic match with the Hughes family profile as valid. These adjustments ensured that Sophia would never again be considered missing in any report, and investigative agencies nationwide would no longer submit search data related to her. Additionally, the CBI coordinated with the Social Security Administration to issue a new Social Security number for Sophia, as there was no record proving she had ever been issued one in childhood. The federal government has special procedures for long-term abduction victims using the restored birth certificate, DNA confirmation, and investigative records to issue a new number without requiring tax or education history. This allowed Sophia to begin building a legal record from a safe and valid starting point. Another system needing updates was federal medical records, especially for future Medicaid and Medicare programs. Denver Hospital transferred all treatment data for Jane Doe to the new identity, ensuring Sophia could continue treatment, access health insurance, and receive long-term psychological support. All prior incorrect information was removed to avoid confusion in diagnosis and treatment. Furthermore, Sophia's case required an additional step, removing any legal records that could cause misunderstanding, including descriptions of her as unidentified homeless person or suspected illegal immigrant in Utah and Colorado. These records were accurate at the time, but if retained, could affect Sophia's future legal and social rights. The CBI sent correction requests to police departments, social centers, and the 2 hospitals that had previously treated her, ensuring Sophia's records became consistent across all systems. When all legal procedures were complete, Sophia Hughes officially regained her status as a U.S. citizen with full rights. Though she could not consciously grasp the importance of restoring her identity, This process created the foundation for all long-term support measures. In the final report on the identity restoration phase, Whitaker noted, Sophia Hughes's identity was not only restored on paper, but rebuilt in every system that had once considered her non-existent. This was the first complete step bringing the victim's life back to legal order after 46 years of being stripped of societal presence. After Sophia Hughes's legal identity was fully restored, and all national civil systems uniformly recognized her as the surviving victim of the 1966 abduction, the CBI moved to an equally critical phase, supporting Sophia's social reintegration. This required coordination among many experts, psychological, legal, medical, social, because Sophia lacked not only legal foundations, but also all basic social experiences that a normal adult would have. The first and most important step was psychological support. The specialist team at Denver Hospital developed a long-term therapy program tailored for victims raised in isolation. Sophia was assessed as having relatively full functional cognition, but severely limited in social interaction processing, understanding time concepts, family relationships, and personal rights. Specialists began with one-on-one sessions, helping her identify basic emotions, build safety in the new environment, and reduce defensive curling or avoidance reflexes when approached. These therapy sessions did not aim to evoke past memories, since Sophia had no childhood memories, but to help her develop what she had never had the chance to, the feeling that she had the right to exist, to make decisions, and to have a place in the wider world beyond the cabin. Many sessions focused on helping Sophia understand simple concepts like family, home, and identity, which previously were just meaningless sounds to her. In the early stage, Sophia showed anxiety when hearing the name Sophia, not because she remembered anything, but because the sound carried meaning she could not comprehend. The therapy team conducted identity reorientation, helping her associate the name with images, documents, and trustworthy people, gradually building a foundation for psychological stability. Alongside psychological therapy, Sophia received comprehensive legal support. A lawyer specializing in long-term abduction victims was appointed to ensure her legal rights were fully protected. Sophia had to be guided on things most people take for granted: how to use identification documents, the right to refuse sharing personal information, the right to request assistance, and the right to legal representation in any administrative procedure. The lawyer explained her newly issued Social Security number, the importance of medical records, and the benefits she could receive from federal programs for human trafficking or prolonged abduction victims. In particular, since Sophia had lived undocumented for decades, building her legal foundation had to be done as if starting life from scratch, opening tax records, registering for health insurance, applying for a federal patient identifier, and preparing supporting documents if she later wanted to relocate or enroll in financial assistance programs. While the lawyer handled the legal aspects, a social work team was tasked with rebuilding Sophia's personal life, gradually integrating her into a world she had never learned to exist in. The first task was arranging stable housing. Since Sophia could not yet live independently, the CBI coordinated with an adult victim support center to provide semi-supported housing, a safe, quiet space with on-site staff, but allowing the necessary privacy. Then, the social work team developed a plan to teach basic life skills: how to use money, purchase essentials, navigate the city, use a clock, recognize signs, and handle simple social situations. These lessons proceeded slowly, adjusted to Sophia's absorption capacity, and always with a guide to avoid overwhelming her. An essential part was medical support. Sophia underwent a full checkup, nutritional assessment, vision and hearing tests, and evaluation of long-term issues from lack of childhood medical care. Doctors noted signs of chronic malnutrition, mild osteoporosis, and dental enamel problems from years without dental care. A long-term treatment plan was created, including nutritional supplements, physical therapy, and regular health monitoring. During reintegration, the social work team also tried to help Sophia understand the family aspect. Mary's presence, though emotionally significant, could not be pushed to frequent interaction immediately. Experts determined that too many or too quick meetings could overload Sophia emotionally and cause reverse effects. Instead, they arranged short, guided visits to gradually familiarize Sophia with the existence of an important person in her life that she could not yet fully understand. Though Sophia had no memories of Mary, these short sessions helped form a new type of recognition, not based on memory, but on a sense of safety when with someone who cared for her. As therapy sessions, legal support, and life skills rebuilding stabilized, Sophia began showing signs of adaptation. She actively maintained eye contact longer, started using short sentences, and sometimes displayed curiosity about everyday items like calendars, books, or radios. For the experts, these signals were evidence of Sophia's potential to build a new life, even if the past losses could not be completely erased. At the end of the initial support phase, the social work team's report stated, "Sophia is learning to become a person with identity, rights, and a future." Each small step is a victory in the journey of rebuilding a life after 46 years separated from society. This was only the beginning of the recovery process, but it was the strongest foundation Sophia had ever had in her life. When Sophia Hughes had received initial support for reintegrating into society and her legal identity had been fully restored, the CBI proceeded with one final but historically significant task: drafting the official closing report, thereby concluding the 46-year-old case file. This is a step that every cold case only achieves when all evidence, behavioral analysis, forensic data, and identity cross-verification are in absolute agreement, with no remaining major points of doubt. Jonathan Whitaker, the individual who had led the reinvestigation from the moment the DNA match indicator appeared, was assigned the task of drafting the final report. He began by constructing a comprehensive summary of the entire investigative process, from the day Sophia went missing in 1966 in Fort Collins to the discovery of the victim alive in 2012. The report divided the process into phases. The initial investigation, 1966, the deadlock phase, and the first transfer of the file to cold case status, 1967, the reanalysis of the scene, and the Wyoming escape route by investigator Monroe, 1970, tracing Avery, and the Wyoming, Utah, leads 1970s, 1990s, age progression efforts, and the Elena lead, 1992, legal limitations in Utah, and the second deadlock. The search of the cabin after Avery's death, 1998, the victim's wandering journey and hospitalization in Denver, DNA analysis, and partial match, 2012, forensic genealogy, confirming identity, reconstructing Avery's behavior, investigating potential accomplices, and finally restoring legal identity to Sophia. Whitaker presented each phase systematically, clarifying why the investigation spanned decades, lack of DNA technology, errors in initial evidence collection, the perpetrator's cross-state movements, the victim's absolute isolation, and the death of key witnesses. Each factor was explained to illustrate why the case could not be resolved in its historical context. The next section of the report was the synthesis of evidence, divided into four major groups. The first group was physical, circumstantial evidence, including photos of the cabin, children's items, old newspapers about Sophia's disappearance found in Avery's cabin, along with handwritten notes indicating concealment. Although this evidence did not name the victim, it confirmed that Avery had lived with an unidentified child and was clearly aware of the child's origins. The second group was witness evidence, accounts from Wyoming neighbors about the strange little girl, testimony from Moab residents about Elena without documents, and descriptions from Utah social workers. These statements, when considered in isolation, lacked legal weight, but when placed alongside DNA evidence and the movement timeline, they formed a tightly logical chain. The third group was forensic, genetic evidence, the pillar of the entire conclusion, partial DNA match in CODIS, 100% mtDNA match with Mary Hughes' maternal line, genealogical analysis, establishing Sophia's unique genetic position in the family tree, and morphological comparison, including the birthmark behind the ear, wrist pigmentation, facial bone features, and eye shape. This was the strongest evidence group, with absolute legal value. The final group was behavioral, timeline evidence, including Avery's travel records from Colorado to Wyoming and Utah, the victim's appearance in witness descriptions across multiple phases, and behavioral characteristics fully consistent with the substitute child abduction model. Whitaker emphasized that all evidence, whether direct or circumstantial, led to a single conclusion, with no direction contradicting the aggregated data chain. Once all evidence had been presented, the report moved to the legal evaluation section. Whitaker concluded that there was absolute grounds to identify Avery as the sole perpetrator in the 1966 abduction of Sophia Hughes. He had hidden the victim, raised her in isolation, moved across multiple states to avoid detection, and never revealed her true identity. Although Avery died in 1998, he was still identified as legally responsible for the entire criminal conduct. The report also noted that the man in the green hat, a potential secondary suspect, could not be pursued due to lack of evidence and his death in 1979, but this did not affect the central conclusion of the case. In the final evaluation, Whitaker clearly stated, "The victim's identity has been confirmed through forensic evidence, genealogy, identification, and direct confirmation from relatives. No elements remain unexplained within the scope of the 1966 abduction." With all concluding sections complete, the CBI classified the case file as solved, victim alive. A rare designation in the Colorado cold case system, the case was closed, not because investigation was no longer possible, but because the truth had been comprehensively illuminated. On the day the official report was signed, the CBI sent copies to the Hughes family, Denver Hospital, Civil Records Office, NCIC, and NAMUS. This was the first time in the case's history that all federal agencies agreed on the final conclusion. The Sophia Hughes file, empty for 46 years, was finally completed, no longer an open-ended story, but a fully resolved case through the combination of modern technology, persistent investigation, and the victim's extraordinary survival. Although the Sophia Hughes case file had been classified as solved and the victim's identity fully restored, the CBI's final report still devoted a separate chapter to acknowledging the gaps that could never be closed. Parts of the story for which no evidence remained to provide definitive answers. These gaps did not weaken the main conclusion of the case, but they served as a reminder that some pieces had permanently vanished with time, witnesses, and the perpetrator. The first and largest gap concerned the true role of Robert Hale, the man in the green hat, who appeared in the days before the abduction. Although witness descriptions matched Hale's appearance, and his travel history showed him in Colorado just before the incident, and in Wyoming at the same time as Avery, there was no direct evidence proving the two collaborated. No documents, letters, photos, or testimony remained to verify any relationship. Nor were there physical traces from the Utah cabin or Hale's home indicating any connection. Whitaker assessed the possibility that Hale played a surveillance or peripheral support role as plausible, but it could not be elevated to legally grounded status. Since Hale died in 1979, probing the past became impossible. All questions about his motive, role, or level of knowledge in the abduction remained at the level of speculation. The CBI noted this as one of the mysteries that would never be clarified. The second gap revolved around why Avery chose Sophia. Psychological profiles indicated that the substitute child motive best fit his behavior. But why Sophia? Why the child from the Hughes family, in a non-isolated neighborhood, remained an unanswerable question. There was no confession, no record of Avery's thoughts, no witnesses seeing him approach the family beforehand, except vague descriptions of a strange truck. It was possible Avery chose Sophia because she was the only child outside in the yard at the moment he passed by, but it was also possible he observed the family for days prior. It could also be that Sophia's resemblance to Avery's deceased child was the triggering factor. But no photos of Avery's child remained for comparison. The nature of this choice, deliberate or opportunistic, remained submerged in the case's shadows. The third gap concerned the initial moments of the abduction, the time when Sophia vanished from sight in a very short window. There were no direct witnesses seeing Avery carry Sophia away, no detailed descriptions of the vehicle leaving the neighborhood at the exact moment. and no physical evidence at the scene to reconstruct the victim's final movements. The only tire tracks recorded were too rudimentary to determine direction. Witness accounts of noises or strange vehicles contradicted each other, and the scene had been disturbed by spontaneous search efforts less than an hour after Sophia disappeared. All this made the most critical phase, the transition from missing to abducted, impossible to reconstruct with any investigative tool. Those initial minutes, though inferred through the subsequent timeline, remained beyond verification. Another gap lay in Sophia's life with Avery during her early years, a period with no medical, educational, or social records whatsoever. Wyoming witnesses only glimpsed a child's silhouette. They did not know how she was cared for, what she was fed, or if she ever fell ill. There were no diaries, no detailed notes beyond a few scattered lines in a small notebook at the Utah cabin. This left the entire phase from Sophia's removal from Fort Collins to her becoming the strange child in Wyoming, a complete blank, filled only by inferences based on the perpetrator's behavioral pattern. Another mystery that could not be closed concerned the period when Avery left Utah and abandoned Sophia. No one knew how he left, why, whether he warned her or simply vanished without a trace. There was no letter, no will, no message in the cabin. Sophia's departure from the cabin and beginning of her wandering could have resulted from being abandoned, but it did not rule out the possibility she was forced to leave because the cabin was no longer safe. The CBI could not determine whether Avery died shortly after leaving Utah or lived elsewhere for a long time. The gap regarding the motive for abandonment and the circumstances of the separation between Avery and Sophia would forever remain unfilled. Finally, the report also highlighted a paradox of the case. Despite the clear legal conclusion, many emotional pieces would never have answers. Sophia could not recount what happened. She had no memories of her childhood. Avery died before being investigated, taking all motives, decisions, and details of the abduction to the grave. Mary would never know why her daughter was chosen, how she lived those years, or whether she ever experienced moments of happiness. These gaps could not be compensated by science or law. They belonged to the part of the case that time had permanently erased. Ending the chapter on unclosable gaps, Whitaker wrote a short line: "We know what we need to know to close the file, but there will always be things Sophia carries in silence, things no investigative file can ever reach." The Sophia Hughes case, after being officially classified as solved and undergoing a rare identity reconstruction process in U.S. investigative history, left a profound legacy for law enforcement, particularly in the fields of missing persons investigations and backlog case analysis. The CBI report's conclusion not only closed the 46-year journey of one victim, but also emphasized the case's significance for the future of the profession. The first point, strongly affirmed, was the irreplaceable role of DNA and forensic genealogy. The case began in an era when fingerprints were still stored manually, scene photos lacked standardization, and genetic analysis was non-existent. Without the development of DNA technology, particularly autosomal DNA comparison, mtDNA, and expanded genealogical matching, Sophia Hughes might have remained a Jane Doe forever in the Denver hospital system. Forensic genealogy not only identified her, but also reconnected the victim with her lineage after nearly half a century. This was clear evidence that family DNA data, even if incomplete, could become the key to unlocking a case when processed with the right technology at the right time. From this, the CBI recommended continuing to expand the national DNA database, encouraging families of missing persons to provide samples, and promoting collaboration with commercial genealogy databases under strict legal frameworks. Another important lesson came from the errors of 1966, errors not due to individuals, but to the limitations of that era. Incomplete scene documentation, improperly recorded tire tracks, disturbed search areas, and misdirected investigative focus in the early days caused opportunities to identify the perpetrator to be missed. The report concluded that if the scene had been better protected, if tire tracks had been photographed to standard, or if witnesses had been interviewed sooner, the investigation might not have deadlocked for decades. This has driven law enforcement to strengthen standardized procedures, for handling child missing cases, emphasizing that the first hours are decisive, and every small error can cause a case to slip away for years. However, despite initial errors prolonging the case, it also demonstrated the value of never abandoning a cold case. Periodic reviews, from Monroe to Blake to Whitaker, were critical links keeping the case alive in the files. Without the 1970 review, the Wyoming direction would not have opened. Without the 1992 analysis, age-progressed images would not have been released. Without the 2012 DNA entry, the partial match with the Hughes family would never have appeared. Each investigative phase, though not producing an immediate breakthrough, became a central foundation for the next generation. This affirmed a key principle: a cold case is not the end of investigation, but a temporary pause, always with the potential to revive when technology or circumstances change. The conclusion also emphasized that the system's persistence, and that of the victim's family, was the factor leading to resolution. The Hughes family never removed Sophia's name from records, never missed a DNA program, and never refused cooperation over decades. Their perseverance preserved the few remaining data fragments until the moment they could be pieced together into truth. Ending the report, Whitaker wrote a line considered the essence of the entire case. Technology solved the case, but it was the persistence of hope that kept it from ever dying. The final section of the report addressed the symbolic value of closing the case after 46 years. This was not merely closing a file in the system, but recognizing a human being who had existed, despite being stripped of identity for most of her life. For Sophia, closing the case was not an end, but the beginning of a new journey. One where she no longer had to live as a name belonging to no one. For U.S. law enforcement, the case became a milestone proving that time does not obscure truth, as long as there are people willing to pursue it to the end. And thus, after nearly half a century, the Sophia Hughes file was closed, not in the darkness of mystery, but in the light of knowledge, perseverance, and belief in the value of every lost life. The story of Sophia Hughes, a child who disappeared in 1966 and was only found after 46 years, is not just a journey of relentless investigation, but also reflects many very real issues in contemporary American life. The fragility of community safety, the role of technology, the importance of personal data, and especially each family's responsibility in protecting children. The case shows that a single moment of lost vigilance led to a tragedy spanning nearly half a century. Today, despite advanced surveillance technology and the Amber Alert system, families still need to maintain vigilance, understanding that abduction risks do not only come from stranger danger, but sometimes from individuals with psychological issues, like Avery, who lost a child and acted on a substitute motive. The second lesson comes from the initial errors of 1966, disturbed scene, improperly photographed tire tracks, and misdirected early focus. This reminds us that in emergencies, proper coordination between community and authorities is essential. Do not spontaneously rush into the scene or act disorganized. Instead, let trained forces handle it correctly. Another lesson lies in the power of DNA and family data storage. The Hughes family provided DNA samples in the 1980s, a small act, but it unlocked the case decades later. Today, with DNA databases increasingly common, updating medical records, genetic information, and identification photos for children not only serves health, but can become a life-saving key in the future. Finally, Sophia's reintegration journey reminds us of society's responsibility towards survivors of trauma. A strong society not only uncovers truth, but also supports those returning from darkness. In modern life, this means building safe communities, respecting mental health, and never abandoning anyone, even when their past is filled with gaps. Thank you for joining us on the journey to close the 46-year-old Sophia Hughes case. A story reminding us that truth is always worth continuing to seek. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories decoded from the shadows, and see you in the next video.